Hello guys, welcome to Bald Voldemort. Today we have an incredible story for you. What if Harry was the son of Superman and his magic made him immune to kryptonite? If you enjoy the video, please like and subscribe. Let's get into it. Chapter 1. The boy who bent steel. The crack in the kitchen wall had been there since Harry was 7. He'd made it on a Tuesday, which he remembered specifically because Dudley had smeltings practice on Tuesdays and the house was almost quiet. Almost. Uncle Vernon had been in one of his moods. The kind that started with a newspaper slammed on the table and ended with Harry being shoved into the cupboard under the stairs, and something in Harry had just snapped. Not emotionally, physically. His hand had shot out to catch himself against the wall and his fingers had gone straight through the plaster like it was wet paper. He'd stared at the hole for a long time. Then he'd covered it with a poster of the British countryside that Aunt Petunia never questioned because she never looked at the cupboard wall. Never looked at Harry either if she could help it. That was 4 years ago. Harry was 11 now and the crack had grown because he kept sleeping against that wall and apparently even in his sleep he was doing something to the plaster. He lay on his cot on the morning of his 11th birthday and listened to the Dursleys move around upstairs. Dudley's footsteps were a familiar thunder. Vernon's were slower, deliberate, the walk of a man who owned every room he entered. Petunia's were quick and bird-like and anxious. Harry had catalogued all of their sounds the way other kids catalogued football stats or song lyrics, because in this house, knowing what was coming was the only power he had. Well, that and the other things. He sat up and looked at his hands in the gray morning light that crept under the cupboard door. They looked completely ordinary, a bit thin, a bit scraped from gardening duty last week. Ink stain on his right index finger from the essay Mrs. Figg had made him write during that stretch of afternoons she'd watched him. Ordinary hands. He pressed his thumb against the metal latch of his cot frame, the one that had been broken since he arrived here, and bent it back straight without thinking about it. Yeah, he thought, ordinary. The thing was, Harry had been doing extraordinary things for so long that they'd stopped feeling extraordinary. He was fast, faster than fast, really, fast in a way that made his own eyes struggle to keep up if he wasn't concentrating on slowing down. He was strong in a way that had broken 3 chairs, 2 door handles, 1 bicycle frame, and a significant portion of Dudley's old swing set in the garden. He didn't bruise. He'd fallen out of a tree at 9, a solid 15 feet onto packed dirt, and stood up and brushed himself off while the neighbor's kids stared at him with wide eyes and never quite looked at him the same way again. And then there was the magic. That was newer. Or rather, the awareness of it was newer. Looking back, Harry thought the magic had always been there, woven into him the same way everything else was, but it had taken longer to make itself known. The first time something manifested, a proper, undeniable magical event, he'd been 6 and Dudley had been trying to take his library book. The book had flown off the floor, smacked Dudley square across the face, and returned to Harry's hands. He'd looked down at it. He'd looked up at Dudley, who was bleeding from his nose and crying. Harry had been put in the cupboard for a week over that one, but after that, the magic kept happening. Small things, big things. Once when he was 8, Uncle Vernon had raised his hand and something had happened between them. A pulse, invisible but real, that sent Vernon stumbling backward into the refrigerator hard enough to dent it. Vernon had never raised his hand again. He'd found other ways to make Harry's life difficult, but that particular avenue had closed permanently, and Harry suspected some instinct in Vernon recognized that it wasn't going to end in his favor. The things he could do weren't separate from each other, he'd figured out. They were the same. When he bent metal or moved too fast or lifted things that should have crushed him, it felt identical to when the magic came, like drawing from the same well. Like breathing in and breathing out, both motions belonging to the same body. He just didn't know what that meant yet. Upstairs, Dudley let out a bellow of delight. Birthday presents being opened. Harry pulled on his jeans, Dudley's old ones, 3 sizes too big, held up with a piece of rope and his oversized gray shirt and sat on his cot and waited for the kitchen call. It came 8 minutes later. Boy, breakfast. Harry emerged from the cupboard into the hallway, blinking in the light. The kitchen table was covered in Dudley's presents and Dudley himself was in the center of them, red-faced with glee, tearing paper off a box that appeared to contain some kind of video game system. Vernon was at the head of the table with his newspaper. Petunia was at the stove, her back deliberately turned to the cupboard. Eggs, she said without looking at him. And don't burn them. Harry made eggs. He made them perfectly, as he always did, not because he was trying to impress anyone, but because he discovered early that doing things poorly resulted in consequences, and doing them excellently resulted in being ignored, and being ignored was far preferable. He moved around the kitchen with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been doing this since he was old enough to reach the stove with a step stool, and he didn't bother speaking, and the Dursleys didn't bother speaking to him. It was, by any measure, a normal Tuesday except that it was a Saturday, and except that there were letters. They came at 6 minutes past 7. Petunia was the first to notice, because she'd gone to fetch the milk from the front step, and she came back into the kitchen walking slowly, holding an envelope at arm's length like it might bite, her face the specific color of curdled cream. "Vernon," she said. That was all she said. Just his name and a voice like the floor had disappeared. Vernon looked up from his newspaper. He saw the envelope. He put the newspaper down very carefully. Harry, who was washing up at the sink, turned to look and saw his own name on the envelope. Mr. H. Potter, The Cupboard Under the Stairs, 4 Privet Drive, Little Winging, Surrey. He felt something in his chest do a complicated thing. "That's mine," he said. "No," Vernon said immediately. "It's got my name on it. You're not taking it." Harry turned around fully and looked at his uncle. Vernon was a big man, broad and red-faced, with a neck like a boiled sausage and a temper that had a very short leash. He was also, Harry had understood for some time now, very afraid of him. He just wore the fear as anger the way men like Vernon always did. "It's a letter with my name on it," Harry said. "I'm going to need you to give it to me." Something in his voice, calm, level, not asking, not demanding, just stating, made Petunia flinch backward. Vernon's face went a deeper red. "You don't tell me what to do in my own house, boy." Harry crossed the kitchen, took the letter from Petunia's unresisting fingers and opened it. He read it again, he looked up. Vernon had risen from his chair. Dudley had gone still, which was unusual enough to be notable. The kitchen felt small and charged. "I'm going to a school," Harry said. "Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry." He considered the letter. "September 1st, that gives me about 3 weeks. "You are not, Uncle Vernon," Harry said, and the patience in his voice was absolute, the kind that had no edge because it had no need for one. "I've broken 3 of your chairs and put a crack in the kitchen wall, and I've been living in a cupboard for a decade. We both know you're not actually going to stop me from doing anything I've decided to do. So the question is whether this is a conversation or an argument, and I'd genuinely prefer a conversation." The silence was very thick. More letters came that morning. They came through the mail slot, through the window, eventually down the chimney. A fluttering, increasingly insistent cascade of parchment envelopes that Dudley tried to catch and Vernon tried to intercept, and Harry simply stood in the middle of and watched with something that might have been wonder. The letters found him with a persistence that felt almost personal, like they knew exactly where he was and were determined to make absolutely sure he got the message. He did get the message. He'd gotten it the first time. He'd always known he was different. Known it in the particular, intimate way that you know something you've never been told, but your bones carry regardless. The letters just told him what kind of different. 3 days later, when a man named Rubeus Hagrid knocked the door off its hinges at a seaside shack where Vernon had dragged them all in a desperate and utterly futile attempt to escape the letters, Harry looked up at the largest human being he had ever seen, broader than any man he'd encountered, with a great dark beard and kind, beetle-black eyes, and felt something settle in his chest like a key turning in a lock. "You're here about Hogwarts," Harry said. Hagrid blinked. "How'd ya?" "The letters," Harry nodded. "I read them, all of them. I've been waiting for someone to show up." He stood, and despite being 11 and small for his age, he somehow carried the posture of someone who had decided to take up exactly the space they deserved. "I want to go." Hagrid broke into a grin so wide it rearranged his entire face. "O' course ya do, you're a wizard, Harry." "I know," Harry said. Hagrid blinked again. "Most kids are a bit more surprised." "I've been bending steel since I was 7, Harry said. "Somehow a magic school makes a lot of sense." Hagrid looked at him for a long, curious moment, a look that mixed fondness with something more complicated, something almost careful. Then he reached into his coat and produced a slightly squashed birthday cake. "Right then, happy birthday," Harry smiled, "a real one, the kind that reached the corners." "Thank you, that's the first birthday cake I've ever had." The something complicated on Hagrid's face deepened. He glanced at the Dursleys, at Petunia, who was looking at the wall with the studied blankness of someone with a great deal on their conscience, and something in Hagrid's expression went briefly, quietly furious. But he didn't say anything. He just turned back to Harry and handed over the cake. Vernon made one attempt at protest. He stood, gathered himself, and pointed at Hagrid. "I demand that you leave this." "Sit down, Vernon," Harry said without looking at him. Vernon sat down. Hagrid's eyebrows rose very slightly. The train from King's Cross was a revelation, not the train itself exactly. Harry had been on trains before, school trips and the occasional tortured outing with the Dursleys, and the Hogwarts Express was lovely, all gleaming red with golden trim, but it was still just a train. What was revelatory was the platform. Platform 9 3/4, which Hagrid had told him about, and which Harry had found by walking directly at the apparently solid barrier between platforms 9 and 10 at a brisk and confident pace. Exactly as instructed. He'd walked through the wall without hesitation. Some small part of him had wondered, briefly, whether walls meant different things to him than to other people, whether his particular relationship with physical barriers was relevant here. But the barrier was genuinely magical. He'd felt the transition, the way the air changed texture, the slight shimmering wrongness of passing through something that physics insisted was solid but magic insisted wasn't. It was, he thought, a bit like him. Something that looked like one thing and was entirely another. He found an empty compartment and settled in with his trunk and headwig. The snowy owl Hagrid had bought him in the Diagon Alley pet shop, who had regarded Harry with enormous golden eyes for approximately 4 seconds before climbing onto his arm with the confident air of an animal that had already decided who it belonged to. Harry had been absurdly, unexpectedly moved by this. He'd put her on his arm and she'd clicked her beak at him, and something in his chest had pulled like a thread being tugged. He'd had precisely 0 pets in his life. He'd had precisely 0 things that were his in any meaningful sense. The owl felt significant in a way he couldn't have articulated. Diagon Alley itself had been overwhelming and wonderful and full of moments that Harry was still processing. Gringotts, the wizard bank, run by goblins, which was astonishing and also made immediate sense in the way that genuinely good ideas always did, had given him a vault key and led him down into the depths of the bank where a vault waited for him. Not just any vault. His parents' vault, full of gleaming gold that represented a financial independence he hadn't known he possessed. He'd stood in the vault and looked at the gold and thought about his cupboard. He'd thought about it for about 4 seconds, and then he'd taken what he needed for the school year and gone to buy his books, and that was that. The wand shop was the other moment that stayed with him. Ollivander's was dim and dusty, and its proprietor appeared to materialize from the shadows the way people only did in stories. Mr. Ollivander was very old and had silver eyes that made Harry feel briefly like he was being anatomized, and he moved through the shop like a man who knew exactly where everything was and was only performing the browsing for the benefit of his customers. He tried Harry with several wands. Each one did something odd. Not bad odd, just odd, a slight tremor in the wood, a hesitation, as if the wand was trying to make up its mind about something. The third wand, Dragon Heartstring, 11 inches, quite springy, shot sparks at the ceiling in a decent imitation of acceptance before stopping, as if reconsidering. Mr. Ollivander had taken the wand back and looked at Harry for a long time. Interesting, he said. What is? Harry asked. Most wands choose their wizard within 6 or 7 tries. You're rejecting them, or rather, Ollivander paused, tilting his head. They're not quite wrong, they're not quite right either, as if you're too large for them. I'm pretty small for my age, actually. Not physically, Mr. Potter. Ollivander disappeared into the back and returned with a box that looked older than the others. Holly and Phoenix feather, 11 inches, nice and supple. The Phoenix who gave a feather for this wand gave only one other feather. Do you know what wand that feather went into? I'd guess this is the part where you tell me, Harry said. Ollivander's mouth twitched. He held out the wand. Harry took it. The rush that moved through him when his fingers closed around the handle was not subtle. It was not the polite shower of sparks he'd seen from the previous attempts. It was a column of gold and scarlet light that erupted from the wand tip and hit the ceiling and flooded the shop with warmth. And simultaneously, Harry felt something unlock in his chest. Something that had been sitting there his whole life, waiting. Something that recognized the wand the same way Hedwig had recognized him. The magic in the wand and the magic in him clicked. Ollivander was staring at the wand, then at Harry, then at the wand again, and his silver eyes were very wide and doing something complicated. Curious, he said quietly. Very curious. I've sold thousands of wands, Mr. Potter. I've felt Phoenix feathers sing before, but I've never felt it, he stopped. How unusual. What? It doesn't feel quite like a wand choosing a wizard, Ollivander said slowly. It feels like a wand recognizing something in a wizard that it already knew, as if it were expecting you. He looked up. Have you done magic before, Mr. Potter? Quite a lot, Harry said honestly. Without a wand, always without a wand, until right now. Ollivander nodded, slow and thoughtful. 7 galleons, he said. And be careful, Mr. Potter. That combination, Holly, Phoenix feather in those particular proportions, carries history, power. Whatever is in you that the wand recognized, take care with it. I'm generally very careful, Harry said. He pocketed his wand and the warmth of it settled into his palm like a second heartbeat. He was genuinely very careful. He was also, he had come to understand, genuinely very dangerous, and he was not afraid of either of those things. The compartment door slid open about an hour into the journey, and a round-faced boy with a toad looked in, apologized, and started to slide the door shut again. Come in if you like, Harry said. The boy, Neville Longbottom, as it turned out, who'd lost his toad, Trevor, which appeared to be a recurring situation, came in and sat across from Harry with the slightly bewildered air of someone who hadn't expected that to work. They talked easy and pleasant until Neville went off in search of Trevor and a red-haired boy poked his head in. "Anyone in here?" Ron Weasley had freckles in abundance, a smear of something that might have been jam on his nose, and the slightly cautious look of someone with 4 older siblings who had all previously occupied this exact stretch of train journey. "Everywhere else is full." "Just me," Harry said. "Sit down." Ron sat. They looked at each other. "I'm Ron." "Harry." Ron's eyes went very slightly wider. He stared at Harry's forehead and then, with visible effort, looked away. Harry pulled his fringe down instinctively. The scar was there, a jagged lightning bolt had been there his whole life. He was used to people clocking it. "Sorry," Ron said. "It's just everyone says you'll be, famous." "Apparently," Harry said. "Does it bother you people staring?" Harry thought about this honestly. "Not really. People have always looked at me a bit oddly. Figured that out when I was young." He glanced out the window at the passing countryside. "What bothers me is people thinking they already know me based on a story they've heard. I'd rather just be, I don't know, judged on what I actually do." Ron considered this. "That's fair." He pulled out a slightly squashed parcel. "Mum packed enough sandwiches for an army. You want one?" "Yes, thanks." Harry took a corned beef sandwich and found it was genuinely excellent. "Your mum knows what she's doing with sandwiches." "Tell her that and she'll adopt you," Ron said, and then looked briefly alarmed, as if he'd said something more complicated than he intended. Harry just laughed. They were halfway through chocolate frog cards when the compartment door opened again, this time with more confidence than either of the previous occupants had shown. The girl who stepped in was carrying an enormous stack of books and had a great deal of bushy brown hair and the expression of someone on a mission. "Has anyone seen a toad? A boy named Neville's lost one." "We haven't," Harry said, "but I'll help look if you like." She looked at him, then at Ron, then back at Harry with a measuring look that was so openly assessing that Harry found it genuinely charming. Most people were subtle about sizing him up. She wasn't bothering. "You've got a smudge of something on your face," she told Ron. "Just so you know." Ron went red and scrubbed at his nose. "It's jam." "I can see that." She looked at Harry again. "I'm Hermione Granger." "I've read all the course books already, have you?" "I've also read a history of magic and magical theory and most of advanced potion making, though that's not until the 3rd year at the earliest." "I read the course books on the train down," Harry said. "Just finished the standard book of spells." Hermione looked startled. "You read all of that in since King's Cross?" "I read fast," Harry said, which was an understatement. He read at a speed that he'd stopped trying to explain to people, because the explanations always caused more confusion than the original fact. Hermione looked at him with an expression that shifted over the course of about 3 seconds from surprise to assessment to something that looked like the beginning of genuine respect. "Hermione Granger," she said again, offering her hand properly this time. "Harry Potter." He shook it. She glanced at his forehead, less obviously than Ron had, but she definitely clocked the scar, and then she said, "You're smaller than I expected, actually. People say that a lot." "It's not a criticism," she said. "Just an observation. Most of the accounts of you are." She stopped, seeming to reconsider. "Anyway, I'll go help Neville find his toad." "I'll come," Harry said and stood. Ron scrambled up as well, scattering chocolate frog cards. "Yeah, all right." The 3 of them moved down the corridor together, and by the time they'd located Trevor in the luggage rack of a compartment at the far end of the train and returned him to a very relieved Neville, something had settled between the 4 of them that felt, in the way of things that matter, permanent. Hogwarts was something else. Harry had been told by Hagrid, by Ron's older brothers on the platform, by the books he'd read on the train, that it was a castle. He'd understood this in the abstract. The abstract, it turned out, had been significantly under-equipped. They crossed the Black Lake in small boats, the castle rising above them in the darkness, lit at every window, towers and parapets and spires climbing up into a sky full of stars, and Harry sat in the prow of his little boat and looked up at it with something he didn't have a word for. Not awe exactly, he wasn't given to awe, but something more complicated, like recognizing something you've never seen. He felt it in his magic and in his bones both. The castle was alive in some important sense. He could feel it. The stone hummed with old power, deep and dense and interwoven, and the magic in his chest resonated with it like a struck bell. Ron was saying something next to him about the ghosts. Hermione was saying something about the astronomy tower. Harry barely heard them. He was busy feeling the castle feeling him and being aware in a way that was both strange and comfortable that whatever this place was, it had been waiting for something like him for a very long time. He'd have thought that was arrogance if it were a thought. It wasn't a thought. It was sensation, physical and certain, the same way hunger was certain or the pressure of cold air on skin was certain. The boats ground onto the shore and they climbed up the bank in the dark, and Harry heard the other first-years around him making small sounds of wonder, and he understood the wonder even if he was experiencing something slightly different. The inside of the castle hit him on multiple levels simultaneously. The moving portraits were peculiar and wonderful. The staircases that changed direction were fascinating. He tracked the logic of it within about 30 seconds and thought, yes, this makes sense, this is a building that thinks. The ghosts drifted through walls and Harry watched them with interest rather than fear, because fear required uncertainty and he was pretty certain ghosts couldn't hurt him. Professor McGonagall met them in the entrance hall. She was a tall, severe woman with spectacles and a face that seemed to have been manufactured for the purpose of not being impressed by anything. She spoke to the first years briskly, turned, and led them toward the great hall. Harry walked with the others and felt the weight of 1,000 eyes as the doors opened. The great hall was vast and golden and had a ceiling that reflected the night sky. 4 long tables in house colors stretched the length of the room. At the head table, teachers sat in a row. Harry scanned them quickly, habit noting faces, postures, the subtle arrangements of people in a hierarchy. The man at the center, very old with a very long beard and half-moon spectacles, met Harry's eyes across the distance of the hall. Dumbledore had to be. He was smiling the specific smile of a man who had expected this moment and was finding it slightly different from his expectations. Harry held his gaze for a moment, steady, and then looked away. The Sorting Hat was a battered, pointed hat that sat on a stool and apparently sang, which it did, at length and with genuine commitment, detailing the 4 houses in broadly rhyming verse. The other students seemed charmed by this. Harry listened with genuine interest not to the song which he'd read about but to the hat itself. There was something alive in it, something intelligent that moved differently from how the portraits moved or the ghosts moved. The hat was thinking. Names were called alphabetically. Lavender Brown, Hufflepuff. Millicent Bulstrode, Slytherin. Hannah Abbott, Hufflepuff. Harry watched each student approach the stool, watched the hat settle on their head, watched the pause before the call. Then Granger, Hermione. Hermione strode forward with the posture of someone who had been preparing for this. The hat took barely 30 seconds. Gryffindor. She went to the Gryffindor table, and one of the twins, the red-haired twins Harry had heard called Fred and George, started applauding with conspicuous enthusiasm which made her smile in spite of herself. Neville Longbottom, Gryffindor. Ron Weasley, Gryffindor, to enormous family cheering from the table. And then Potter Harry. The hall went very quiet. The quiet spread like something dropped in still water, ripples of it moving outward until the only sounds were the candles and Harry's footsteps on the stone floor. He sat on the stool. The hat descended over his eyes. "Ah," said a voice inside his head, dry and ancient and genuinely curious. "Now this is unexpected." "Hello," Harry said. Silently internally, most students don't say hello first. Usually there's more nervousness involved. "I'm not particularly nervous." "No," the hat agreed. "I can see that. In fact, I can see rather a lot, Mr. Potter. May I ask, are you aware of what you are?" Harry felt the question land and sit. "A wizard," he said, "and something else." "Something else indeed. I've sorted 12 generations of magical children, Mr. Potter. I have never encountered a pause long and thinking." "Your mind is extraordinary, not in the way I usually mean that. It's another pause. There are layers here that I cannot reach. Vast, warm layers that have nothing to do with magic and yet are entirely interwoven with it. Like a star had a child and the child learned to cast spells." Harry said nothing. "You do well in any house," the hat went on. "Slytherin would kill to have you and you'd outmaneuver every political machination in that house within a fortnight. Ravenclaw would give you the books you'd devour. Hufflepuff would give you the belonging you've never had." A pause. "But Gryffindor is for people who choose the hard thing," the hat said. "Not because it's easy, not because it's wise, because it's right. And Mr. Potter, whatever you are, whatever the deeper nature of you might be, you will always, always choose the hard thing." "Yes," Harry said, "I probably will." "Gryffindor," the hall erupted. Not just polite applause, a roar that bounced off the stone ceiling and rattled the goblets on the tables. Harry pulled the hat off and handed it back to McGonagall, who was looking at him with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral and not quite succeeding, and he walked to the Gryffindor table and slid in next to Ron. Ron gripped his arm and shook it. "Brilliant. Though honestly I'd have thought Slytherin, the way you stared down Malfoy on the train." "Was there a moment on the train?" Hermione said from Harry's other side, leaning forward. Harry shrugged. A boy named Draco Malfoy had appeared in their compartment somewhere south of Birmingham, flanked by 2 larger boys, and delivered what appeared to be a carefully prepared speech about blood purity and the right sorts of people and the importance of choosing one's friends wisely. He'd offered his hand to Harry with the air of someone conferring a great favor. Harry had looked at the hand. Looked at the 2 larger boys, who would be Crabbe and Goyle, presumably, looked back at Malfoy. "No, thanks," he'd said. Malfoy had gone a very specific shade of pale. Nobody said no to Malfoy, or if they did it nervously. Harry hadn't been nervous. He just stated a preference politely, as if Malfoy's status and the threat implicit in his companions were factors that had failed to register as relevant. This, it turned out, was the most offensive possible response. "You'll regret," Malfoy had started. "I don't think I will," Harry said and picked up his book again. Malfoy had left with his dignity somewhat compressed. His companions had followed, looking confused. Ron had stared at Harry for a moment, then he'd started laughing. "I don't think I handled it wrong," Harry told Hermione now. "No," she said. "I think you handled it in a way I'd never have thought to." She was studying him with that frank assessing look again. "You just weren't afraid of him." "Why would I be?" She opened her mouth, closed it. "Fair point." The feast appeared from nowhere, the tables suddenly laden with food in quantities that made even Ron's eyes widen. Harry ate with genuine appreciation, good food being for him, a novelty that had not yet worn off despite Hagrid's cake and the chocolate frogs on the train. He ate and talked and listened and watched the hall around him, all of it, the motion and the light and the noise. And he let himself feel what it felt like to be somewhere he was meant to be. He let himself feel that for about 4 minutes before his eyes found the Slytherin table, found Malfoy watching him with cold, calculating eyes, and found someone else further down the table, a pale student with a face that seemed too old for their age, something behind the eyes that was dark and coiled and patient. Not important. Not yet. But Harry logged it the way he logged everything. After the feast, after the prefects led them up through the castle's improbable staircases, after the fat lady in her pink portrait swung open on the word Caput Draconis, after the Gryffindor common room revealed itself as round and warm and gold red, Harry went up to the dormitory and sat on the edge of his four-poster bed and looked at his hands. Ordinary hands. He pressed his thumb against the iron frame of the bed. Felt the metal resist, then yield, the way it always did, bending smoothly and without effort. He bent it back. Felt the magic in his wand where it sat in his trunk, humming quietly in the dark. He thought about the hat's words. Like a star had a child and the child learned to cast spells. He'd never known his parents. His mother had been killed when he was a baby. Hagrid had told him some of this, and the books he'd found in Diagon Alley had filled in more. A story involving a dark lord and a curse and a boy who should have died and somehow didn't. His father, James Potter, had died the same night. Only Harry had survived. Harry looked at his scar in the small mirror above the dormitory sink. The lightning bolt stared back at him. He'd always thought it looked less like a wound and more like a signature. The mark something powerful left when it struck something more powerful still and lost. He wondered, not for the first time and with a specificity that had recently sharpened, whether James Potter was his actual father. Not in any way he could explain. Just in the specific way that adopted children sometimes knew, or the way his body kept doing things that bodies weren't supposed to do, the way he bent steel and broke chairs and fell 15 feet and stood up and walked away. James Potter had been a wizard. Human. Fully, completely human. Whatever Harry was, he wasn't entirely that. He lay down on the four-poster with the curtains drawn, the sounds of the castle settling around him, the deep stone thrum of old magic in the walls, and he looked up at the canopy and felt the questions sit in him like a compass waiting for a pole. He'd find out. He was patient. He was also not afraid of what he might learn, which was perhaps the more important quality. Hedwig clicked softly from her cage on the bedpost. "Yeah," Harry said. "I think so too." He slept without dreams, deeply and absolutely still, and in the morning when Ron tried to wake him and found him already dressed and sitting on the window ledge in the dawn light reading his Transfiguration textbook, Ron stared at him for a moment with the expression of someone recalibrating. "Have you been up all night?" "A few hours," Harry said. "The castle's nice in the early morning, very quiet, you can feel it thinking." Ron rubbed his eyes. "You can feel a castle thinking, can't you?" Ron stared at him for another moment. "I'm going back to bed," he announced. "Breakfast is in 20 minutes. "I'm going to get dressed," Ron amended. Harry smiled and turned back to his book, and the early light caught his glasses and his scar and the quality of his attention, that complete, total, absolutely calm attention. And outside the window the grounds of Hogwarts were green and new and full of possibility, and the year was beginning. Whatever he was, Harry Potter was here. And Hogwarts felt, down in its ancient stone and deep in its living magic, like it had been waiting for him. Chapter 2, Sorted into Thunder. The first week of classes taught Harry 3 things. First, magic with a wand felt completely different from magic without one, the way singing felt different from humming. Both were the same sound, the same breath, the same body, but the wand gave it shape, direction. It was the difference between a river and a canal, and he understood within his first Transfiguration lesson why Ollivander had looked at him the way he had, because the wand didn't just channel his magic, it refined it. And what came out was something that made Professor McGonagall set down her quill and look at him over her spectacles with an expression she was working very hard to keep professional. Second, most magical instruction was designed for people who were learning to access power for the first time. Harry was not that, he was learning to aim. Third, the castle genuinely did think. He could feel it every morning from his window perch, the low, constant hum of old magic in the walls, the way the staircases moved not randomly but purposefully, the sense of a vast, slow intelligence that was aware of every student and teacher within its walls. He mentioned this to Hermione on Wednesday morning and she went very still, pulled out a notebook, and asked him to describe it more precisely. It's like standing next to something warm, he said. Something that knows you're there. That's consistent with theory, she said immediately. Hogwarts, a history mentions ambient spell saturation creating a form of emergent consciousness, Harry finished. She looked at him. You've read Hogwarts, a history. On the train, second time on Wednesday night, the sections about castle magic specifically. Hermione put her notebook away with the deliberate care of someone deciding something. You read extraordinarily fast. I know, and you retain everything, mostly everything. She was quiet for a moment. They were walking to Charms, a corridor that changed its slope depending on which direction you were heading. Harry had mapped it on day 2. Can I ask you something personal? Go ahead. Before Hogwarts, when you did magic, what did it feel like? Harry considered the question. It deserved consideration. Like breathing out, he said finally. Like something that was already there finding a direction. Not like learning something new. Hermione nodded slowly with the expression of someone adding data to a mental model she hadn't finished building. She didn't ask anything else. He appreciated that. She was the only person he'd met so far who asked questions the way a scientist asked them because she wanted to understand, not because she wanted to confirm something she already believed. Ron caught up with them at the Charms corridor, slightly out of breath, one shoe untied. The moving staircases are going to be the death of me. I went 3 floors up when I was trying to go 2 floors down. The logic is actually quite consistent once you understand the pattern, Harry said. Brilliant, Ron said. You explain that to me sometime when I haven't already been walking for 20 minutes. Charms was held in a small classroom on the 3rd floor, Professor Flitwick presiding from behind a stack of books that elevated him to a functional height. He was a tiny, enthusiastic man with a squeaky voice and genuinely exceptional technical skill. Harry registered this immediately. The way Flitwick's wand moved with the economy of someone who'd done this 10,000 times and could feel the difference between a spell cast at 90% and one cast at full precision. They were doing Wingardium Leviosa, the levitation charm. Flitwick demonstrated a precise flick and swish, a feather rising from a matchbox lid with the smooth inevitability of something correctly done, and sent them to practice in pairs. Harry was paired with Ron. Hermione next to them was paired with a nervous girl named Parvati Patil. Ron went first. His wand movements were enthusiastic and imprecise. The feathers shivered. He tried again, frowned, adjusted. Wingardium Leviosa, swish at the end, not flick, Harry said. The levitation component is in the swish. The flick is just initiation. Ron adjusted, tried again. The feather rose approximately 3 inches, wobbled and drifted sideways. Better, Harry said. One more adjustment. Your turn, Ron said with the specific expression of someone who wanted to see how the person giving advice handled it themselves. Harry looked at the feather. He thought about the motion, wrist up, then out, then the slight circular quality at the end, and said, Wingardium Leviosa. The feather shot to the ceiling, not floated, not drifted. Shot upward with an enthusiasm that was clearly beyond the intended scope of the exercise, struck the ceiling, and hung there in the way of something unsure whether gravity still applied to it. Several students looked up. Flitwick made a small sound. Harry lowered it back down carefully. Bit much, he said. Bit much, Ron agreed, staring at it. How too much on the swish, Harry said, which was true technically. The real answer was more complicated and he didn't have the vocabulary for it yet. Mr. Potter, Flitwick said, appearing at his elbow from behind his bookstack, looking up at him with wide, excited eyes. Could you do that again, deliberately this time? Harry did it again deliberately and this time caught it before it reached the ceiling and held it there, not at any particular height, just wherever he wanted, responsive to his attention the way his fingers were responsive to his thoughts. He moved it left, right, in a slow circle. The classroom had gone quiet. Fascinating, Flitwick said softly. The precision is, Mr. Potter, this level of control is extraordinary for a first-week student. It feels like the wand knows what I want, Harry said, which was the most accurate thing he could say. The spell is just, he searched for words. Permission, the magic already knows how to do it. Flitwick looked at him with an expression that reminded Harry of Ollivander, that particular quality of wonder and careful attention. Yes, Flitwick said quietly, yes, I think that's exactly right. He moved away to help another student, but he kept glancing back and Harry set the feather down and caught Ron looking at him the way Ron sometimes looked at him, openly, without the pretense of casualness, just flat-out staring. What? Harry said. Nothing, Ron said. It's just you're a bit mad, aren't you? Probably, Harry agreed. In a good way, Ron clarified, mostly. From across the aisle, Hermione had been doing very well with her own feather. It hovered neatly at eye level with textbook precision, and she caught Harry's eye and gave him a look that was measuring and curious, and under all of that, something that might have been the beginning of concern. The kind of concern that intelligent people felt when they encountered something they couldn't yet explain. Harry didn't mind. He'd been unexplainable his whole life. He was patient about it. Defense against the dark arts was on Thursday morning, and the teacher was Professor Quirrell. Harry had noticed Quirrell at the staff table on the first night, quiet, nervous-seeming, wearing an absurd purple turban that he'd been told was a gift from an African prince but which smelled distinctly of garlic. He'd filed Quirrell away as someone to pay attention to, for the same reason he always paid attention to things that seemed slightly wrong. Not conspicuously wrong. Just off, like a note slightly sharp of where it should be. The classroom had garlic hanging from every surface, which was a choice. Quirrell fumbled his notes. He stammered through the textbook passage about the dark arts with the helpless quality of a man who had forgotten how the sentences connected to each other. Harry sat and listened with his full attention and let the class unfold. "See, can anyone tell me," Quirrell said, shuffling papers, though the primary distinction between a sea curse and a hex, several hands, Hermione's was first, which surprised nobody. Quirrell pointed at her. "A curse typically has a more severe and lasting effect and often requires greater magical power to cast," Hermione said. "A hex is usually temporary and less physically harmful, though not always less psychologically harmful." "Quite all right, Miss Granger, yes, quite." Quirrell checked his notes again, his turban tilted slightly. Harry said without raising his hand, "The more interesting distinction is intent. Hexes can be cast reactively without full deliberate intent behind them. A curse generally requires the caster to genuinely mean the harm they're attempting." The room went quiet. Quirrell looked up sharply, something moving briefly in his eyes there and gone, and then the stammer returned. "Yes, that's a reasonable. It's from Saunders' Principles of Dark Craft," Harry said. Chapter 3. The argument is that magic responds to intention as much as technique. A half-hearted curse is less effective than a fully committed hex. "Yes," Quirrell said. The stammer was almost gone. For one fractional, strange second, his posture changed, straightened, settled, became something else. Then Quirrell coughed and shuffled more papers and the nervous mask dropped back into place. "Yes, Q quite right, 10 points to Gryffindor." Harry watched him for the rest of the class. After in the corridor, Hermione walked beside him and said quietly, "You noticed it too. The stammer isn't consistent," Harry said. "It drops when he's engaged with the actual material." "He's afraid of something," Hermione said, "or pretending to be afraid. Both are possible." Harry glanced back at the classroom door. "Either way, I want to read the textbook before next week. I've already read it. Front to back or skipping theory sections?" She paused just slightly. "Front to back." "Good," Harry said. Ron, who had caught up with them, looked between the two of them. "Are you two going to do this all year? Talk about teachers like you're, I don't know, assessing threats," Harry offered. "I was going to say like weird adults, but sure." "Same thing," Hermione said, and Ron laughed despite himself, and the three of them moved down the corridor together in the direction of lunch. On Friday afternoon, a notice went up on the Gryffindor Common Room board. Quidditch TRIALS Gryffindor Team Friday next 5 p.m. All positions considered. See Oliver Wood 6th year to register. Harry read it. Ron read it over his shoulder. "You should try out," Ron said. "I'd thought about it. You'd be brilliant at it. Have you read about Quidditch?" "I read the rulebook on the train," Harry said. "And Quidditch Through the Ages on Tuesday night." Ron stared at him. "You read a book about Quidditch just on a Tuesday?" "I was curious about how the physics worked." "The physics? The snitch specifically, sentient enough to avoid capture, small enough to be missed, fast enough to be a genuine game changer. It's actually a fascinating design problem. The seeker role is the most strategically interesting, because it's the only position where individual ability completely overrides team dynamics." Ron sat down on the arm of a chair with the expression of someone whose brain had just done something unexpected. "So you want to play seeker?" "It seems like the natural fit," Harry said. "I'm fast." He said it simply, factually, the way he said most things. "And I can track small moving objects better than most people." This was, again, technically true and significantly understated. His visual acuity was something he'd tested empirically over years. He could follow a sparrow in flight from 300 meters, could read text at distances that made people look at him oddly, could catch details of motion that most eyes lost before the brain had even registered the initial movement. For a sport that centered on tracking a walnut-sized golden sphere at roughly 150 miles per hour, this seemed relevant. "Oliver Wood is going to lose his mind when he sees you fly," Ron said. He sounded very happy about this. Harry had learned to ride a broom that morning, in the brief period before the scheduled first year's flying lesson. He'd borrowed Neville's Nimbus. Neville hadn't minded, had in fact seemed relieved that Harry was willing to test fly it first, and taken it to the empty grounds at 6 in the morning while the rest of the castle was still sleeping. Mounted it, kicked off. The moment he'd left the ground, he'd known flying was familiar. It was the same sensation as the magic, the same sensation as the strength and the speed, the feeling of his body doing exactly what it was built to do without apology, without restriction. The ground dropping away below him, the cold air, the broom responding to shifts in his weight and intent with a sensitivity that felt like an extension of his own nervous system. He'd gone high, very high. Higher than a broom was strictly required to go in a practice circuit, high enough that the castle looked small below him and the grounds were a patchwork of dark and lighter dark and the lake was a mirror. He'd hung there in the silence, the broom humming under him and breathed. This, he'd thought. This is what it's supposed to feel like. He'd flown circuits for an hour. Not practicing anything specific, just moving, learning the broom's responses, finding out what it would do if he asked it precisely, what it would do if he asked it hard. He'd pulled out of a vertical dive approximately 40 feet from the ground and felt the wind and the cold and the specific pure joy of something being completely, utterly right. And then he'd landed and walked back inside for breakfast and didn't mention it to anyone. The first year's flying lesson was in the afternoon. Madam Hooch, the flying instructor, was a short, sharp-eyed woman with gray hair cut close and yellow eyes like a hawk. She moved around the line of hovering brooms with the assessing manner of someone who'd seen 1,000 students attempt this. Up, she commanded, demonstrating the motion. The broom came to Harry's hand so fast it cracked against his palm. He caught it without looking, which caused Hooch to turn and look at him with those hawk eyes. Good hand, she said, just that. He wondered if she'd seen something in the way he caught it, too fast, too sure, the broom arriving with too much enthusiasm in response to too much of something in his command. But she moved on. Neville's broom took off with him before Hooch gave the signal. He went up and then sideways and then up again and over the castle, and it was clearly an emergency situation. Hooch ordered everyone to stay grounded and flew after him. Everyone stayed grounded except Draco Malfoy, who picked up the small glass orb Neville had dropped in his panic, held it up with an expression that was pure performance, and said something about Longbottom being a pathetic excuse for a wizard and the Remembrall being better served as a target for practice. Put that down, Malfoy, Harry said. Malfoy turned. His smile had the quality of someone who'd been waiting for exactly this kind of confrontation. Behind him, Crabbe and Goyle rearranged themselves into what they probably thought were threatening postures. Going to make me, Potter? Give it back, Harry said. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't moved his hand toward his wand. He was just standing there entirely still with his full attention on Malfoy. Or what? You'll fall off your broom, Malfoy mounted his. Let me show you how a real wizard rides, he threw the Remembrall, not at Harry. Up and away toward the castle, a long arcing throw designed to be symbolic. Look what I think of your friends' things, and Harry watched it go, watched the arc calculated. He got on his broom and moved. Later, Ron would describe it as the most mental thing he'd ever seen on a broomstick, which was saying something because he'd grown up watching Fred and George. Later, Hermione would say she'd barely seen Harry move before he was already 30 feet up and 200 feet across the grounds, moving so fast the broom's tail was a blur. Later, Hooch, who had been returning from the situation with Neville, would land and stand very still for a moment and look at Harry the way Flitwick had looked at him, and the way Ollivander had looked at him. Harry plucked the Remembrall out of the air at the apex of its arc, the glass warm in his fist, and wheeled the broom in a tight curve that should have been physically uncomfortable at that speed and wasn't. He came back down and landed in the same spot he'd taken off from and held out the Remembrall to Malfoy. Give this back to Neville, he said. Madam Hooch had landed. She was looking at him. The expression on her face was something Harry had been seeing a lot of from teachers, a recalibration, a refiling of prior assumptions. Potter, she said, her voice was careful. That was a Wronski feint approach combined with a pursuit dive. Where did you learn? I read about it, Harry said. The book describes the physics well enough. Hooch looked at him for another long moment. Then she looked at Malfoy, who had gone the specific pale that seemed to be his response to Harry not being impressed by him. Malfoy, Hooch said in the voice of someone about to change the subject, give Mr. Longbottom his Remembrall. Now, Malfoy gave it back. The trial the following Friday was less of a trial and more of a formality. Oliver Wood, Gryffindor Quidditch captain, 6th year, the specific kind of Quidditch obsessed that had probably been building since early childhood, watched Harry fly for approximately 4 minutes before letting out a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a sob of relief. Where did you? Wood turned to Professor McGonagall, who had come to watch at Flitwick's urgent recommendation following the flying lesson incident. Professor, look at him. Harry was doing nothing dramatic. He was just flying, reading the pitch, tracking the practice snitch that Wood had released from his bag, a slightly older snitch that moved with the erratic intelligence of something that had been evading capture for years and knew all the standard approaches. Harry watched it for 40 seconds, identified its decision pattern, cut off its escape route at the North Post, and had it in his closed fist before it had registered what was happening. He came down and held it out to Wood. Wood made another sound. McGonagall, who was standing with a clipboard she'd stopped writing on, said in a controlled voice, "Mr. Potter, was that 3 minutes?" "About 3.5, Harry said. The snitch was old enough to have established habits, which made it easier. A newer one would have been less predictable." Wood sat down on his broomstick handle, hovering 6 inches off the ground, staring at Harry. "You're 11, he said. "Yes, 11-year-olds don't fly like that." "I'm a bit unusual," Harry said. "A bit." Wood stopped. He looked at McGonagall. "Professor, he's our seeker. He's been our seeker since before he got here." "I need to." He stood up again, suddenly galvanized. "I need to write a list. I need to plan. Training schedule, pitch booking." "Wood," McGonagall said. "Yes, Professor." "Breathe first." Harry was watching Wood with genuine warmth. He liked Wood, liked his uncomplicated, consuming passion for the thing he loved, the way it wasn't complicated by self-consciousness or strategy. It was just pure enthusiasm aimed at a pure purpose, and there was something clean and good about that. "I'll be at every practice," Harry told him. "Tell me what you need." Wood looked at him. You're going to be the best seeker Gryffindor has had in 20 years. "I'll aim higher than that," Harry said, and he meant it lightly but also completely. The 3 weeks settled into a rhythm that felt, for the first time in Harry's life, like normalcy. Not the performed normalcy of Privet Drive, the deliberate, effortful suppression of everything unusual, but actual normalcy, the kind that included who he genuinely was without apology. Breakfast with Ron and Hermione, Harry eating more than anyone thought was reasonable for his size and Hermione reading, and Ron providing commentary on the weather. Classes, where Harry learned the vocabulary and grammar of a magical discipline he'd been practicing in inarticulate ways his entire life. The library on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, where Hermione catalogued and Harry read, and Ron provided moral support while occasionally playing chess against himself and losing. He was happy. He recognized the quality of it because it was so distinctly unlike everything that had come before, and he let himself just have it, without thinking too hard about what it meant. But the questions didn't stop. He thought about them at night, in the early mornings from his window perch, in the quiet moments between one thing and the next. The Sorting Hat's words, what Ollivander had said, what he'd always known in his body, that he was not entirely what he was supposed to be. He went to the library alone on a Saturday afternoon, 3 weeks into term, and found the section on magical bloodlines and heredity. He read for 2 hours, moving through academic magical genetics with the speed and completeness that was simply how he consumed information. He found what he was looking for, and what he was looking for told him exactly what he'd suspected and nothing more. Magic was hereditary, yes, but not the way he experienced it. Magical children inherited capacity, the genetic predisposition to channel magical energy. They didn't inherit it already built in and running. The difference between potential and presence. He sat back and looked at the page. James Potter had been a wizard. Lily Potter had been a witch, apparently a very gifted one, celebrated particularly for her work in protective enchantments and her profound understanding of magical theory. Either of them could account for the magic. Neither of them, individually or together, accounted for the rest. He thought about his hands in the dark of the cupboard, bent metal under his fingers. He thought about falling from the tree. He thought about the speed that made his eyes struggle to follow, the strength that had never had a natural explanation, the quality of his vision and his attention, and the fact that in 11 years he had never been ill, never stayed bruised, never, now that he thought about it, been genuinely hurt by anything that had tried to hurt him. The protection Hagrid had alluded to, something about his mother's sacrifice creating a magical protection. He'd accepted this explanation when it was given because it explained the survival. What it didn't explain was everything else. Lily Potter's love, powerful as it apparently was not the source of the ability to bend steel at age 7. Something else, the Sorting Hat had said, vast, warm layers that have nothing to do with magic. He put the book back and walked out of the library and down to the lake, where the September afternoon was going golden across the water and the giant squid was creating small disturbances near the far bank. He sat on the grass and watched the water and let the questions sit in him, not with anxiety, just with patience. He'd find out eventually. He always did. Ron found him there an hour later, coming down from the castle with 2 apples and a chess set under his arm. He sat down next to Harry and offered an apple without preamble. "You've got that look," Ron said. "What look?" "The one that means you're thinking about something big and quiet." Harry glanced at him. Ron was looking at the lake, eating his apple. He had, Harry thought, a surprisingly acute sense for other people for someone who could be legendarily oblivious. "Just thinking about who I am," Harry said. "Heavy Saturday afternoon," Ron said. "Is it?" Ron shrugged. "I think about that sometimes too. 6 kids in our family, 3 of them brilliant, Bill, Percy, and in a different way the twins. Charlie's mental about dragons. Then there's me and Ginny at the end and I don't know. It's hard to figure out where you fit when the space is already full. Harry listened to this without filling the silence. Point is, Ron said, I think you fit here, however weird the details turn out to be. He held up the chess set. Play. You know I'll beat you, Harry said. You beat me in 15 moves last time. I've been practicing. Ron set up the board with the confidence of someone who had decided to believe this. Harry beat him in 12. Ron stared at the board. Right, he said, we never speak of this. Agreed. They sat by the lake until dinner, playing chess that Ron kept losing and talking about nothing important, and the castle threw its reflection on the still water, and Harry breathed in the cold, clean air of early autumn and felt the deep-down certainty, the bone-level knowledge that things were in motion. Not a threat, not exactly. More like the feeling before weather changes, that atmospheric shift of pressure that the body registers before the mind has caught up. Something was coming. He didn't know what yet. He was ready anyway. The Saturday after, Harry went to Quidditch practice at dawn because Wood had scheduled it for 7 and arrived at 6 to find the pitch empty. He took a broom from the equipment shed, a school broom, old and slightly temperamental, and flew in the early light. Just flew. No pursuit, no drill, no objective. High and fast and completely alone with 300 feet of autumn air and the waking world spread below him. He didn't notice the figure standing at the edge of the pitch until he came down. And by then the sun was up, and Professor Dumbledore was standing with his hands in the pockets of robes the color of midnight, looking up at him with those half-moon spectacles, and that expression that had been watching Harry since the first night at the feast with a quality he'd been trying to categorize. Was categorizing it now in the morning light as he landed 10 feet away. It was care and guilt, a specific old, careful guilt, the kind that had been carried a long time and was very well managed. Good morning, Professor, Harry said. Good morning, Harry. Dumbledore smiled, warm, genuine, and with something underneath that was complicated. I sometimes come here in the early hours. I find the pitch peaceful when empty. I didn't mean to intrude. Not at all. I was watching you fly. A pause. You are remarkably gifted. Thank you. Harry looked at him steadily. Was there something you wanted to say to me, Professor, or is this a morning walk? Dumbledore's eyes crinkled at the corners. Perceptive. I try. There are things about your history, Dumbledore said slowly with the care of someone choosing words, that I have not been as forthcoming about as perhaps I should have been. I have told myself it was for your protection. And was it? The pause was informative. Partly, Dumbledore said, and partly, he stopped, considered. You are not what I expected, Harry. And I mean that as the greatest compliment I am capable of giving. What did you expect? A frightened child, Dumbledore said honestly, a boy who would need protecting. And instead, Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment with those impossibly blue eyes. Instead, I find myself wondering whether the protection was ever mine to give. Another pause. There are things I know about you and things I suspect, and there are things— He stopped again, and the hesitation was genuine this time, not performance. There are things even I do not know. Tell me the things you know, Harry said. Not yet, Dumbledore said gently, not because I don't trust you, but because some knowledge must be approached at the right speed, or it. With respect, Professor, Harry said, I've been managing extraordinary things my entire life with no information, no guidance, and no preparation. I'm not going to break under information. He met Dumbledore's eyes directly. I'd rather know what I'm dealing with. Dumbledore looked at him. The silence stretched comfortably, unhurriedly, two people who were both extremely patient finding their patience matched. Your mother, Dumbledore said finally, was not only a gifted witch. She was, he seemed to choose. She was in contact briefly with certain individuals from outside our world, the magical world. A pause. Outside the world as we understand it. Harry waited. I believe, and this is belief, not certainty, that what you are, Harry, is not entirely what James Potter's son would have been. Dumbledore held his gaze. And I believe that the power Voldemort could not understand on the night he came to Godric's Hollow was not only your mother's love, it was what you already were. Harry stood very still. The morning air was cold on his face and his hands. I'd like to know more, he said. In time, Dumbledore said, I promise you in time. Something shifted in his expression. The promise of information in time is poor recompense for a childhood without answers. I know that, I'm sorry for it. He meant that, Harry could tell. He could also tell that Dumbledore was afraid, not of Harry, but for him, the fear of someone who'd made a choice they weren't sure was right and was starting to suspect it wasn't. Thank you for telling me that much, Harry said. It confirms some things I'd already thought. Dumbledore blinked very slightly. I've been bending steel since I was 7, Professor. Harry looked at him with perfect calm. I didn't think it was magic. Magic feels different. I knew there was something else. I just didn't know what to call it yet. The sun was fully up now. Voices drifted from the castle, the team arriving for practice, Woods carrying enthusiasm audible from the path. Harry looked toward the sound and then back at Dumbledore. We can talk more, he said. Whenever you're ready to tell me the rest. I will be, Dumbledore said quietly. Sooner than I'd planned, I think. Harry nodded and walked toward the pitch where Oliver Wood was organizing broomsticks with the intense focus of a general preparing a campaign, and he left Dumbledore standing by the pitch in the morning light with the expression of a man rearranging something fundamental in his own understanding. Behind him, he heard Dumbledore say quietly, possibly not intending to be heard, "Extraordinary." Harry thought, "You have no idea yet," and went to practice. Chapter 3, Two Suns Rising. The letter arrived in Metropolis on a Tuesday. Clark Kent almost missed it. He was in the middle of writing a piece on Metropolis City Council corruption. 3 sources, 2 on record, a paper trail that led from a zoning variance to a very expensive beach house, and the letter arrived via a barn owl that had apparently navigated from somewhere in Scotland. Found the Daily Planet building, found the specific floor, found the specific desk, and dropped it directly onto his keyboard with the precision of something that had not traveled this far to be ignored. Clark stared at the owl stared back at him with the absolute authority of its species. He picked up the envelope. The handwriting was his name and address in green ink on yellowed parchment, and in the top left corner a wax seal bore an emblem he recognized with a jolt that moved through him like current. A lightning bolt inside a circle, an emblem he'd seen once 12 years ago on a letter that Lily Evans had shown him with shaking hands and bright eyes, saying, "Clark, I'm from somewhere you won't believe." He opened the envelope under his desk, which was the closest available privacy, and read. "Mr. Kent, forgive the unorthodox method of correspondence. I am writing to you because I believe you have a right to information that has been, for reasons that once seemed sound, withheld from you. My name is Albus Dumbledore. I am the headmaster of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, and I am writing to you regarding a student who enrolled here at the start of this term. His name is Harry Potter. I believe, Mr. Kent, that you should come." Clark read the letter 3 times. Then he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling of the Daily Planet bullpen, the familiar noise around him, phones and keyboards and Jimmy Olsen telling someone loudly about a photograph. And he felt the world do something it had never done before in all his years on Earth, including the years he'd spent discovering what he was. It cracked open. He'd known Lily Evans for 4 months, 12 years ago. She'd come to Metropolis on some kind of research exchange that she'd explained imprecisely and he'd understood to be more complicated than it sounded. She was extraordinary, sharp, and funny, and fundamentally kind in a way that wasn't softness, the kind of kindness that had a spine in it. She could do things with her hands that he didn't have a framework for yet. She'd told him eventually about the world she came from, and he'd told her in return about himself. They'd been 2 impossible people finding each other briefly in an ordinary city, and when she'd left to go back to that world to marry someone she described as her best friend and her right choice and the life she'd already promised, he hadn't looked for her afterward. He'd respected the boundary of it. He'd heard through the contacts he'd eventually developed in that world after years of careful research that she'd died, that her husband had died, that a child had survived. He had not allowed himself to do the arithmetic. He was doing it now. Got up from his desk, went to the stairwell where there were no cameras, went up to the roof of the Daily Planet and stood in the cold November air with the globe spinning behind him. Metropolis spread out below, the harbor glinting, the bridges arcing, the city going about its enormous ordinary life. "A son," he said to the sky. The word felt strange and enormous. He was back at his desk in 45 seconds, writing a note to his editor about needing 3 days off for a family emergency. He arrived at Hogwarts on a Wednesday evening, not as Superman. He had been very precise about that decision. Because arriving in a cape to a school full of children was the kind of entrance that would create complications he didn't need. And also because this was a personal thing, not a Superman thing, and those 2 identities needed different postures for different occasions. He wore the Clark Kent posture, slightly hunched, glasses, the particular careful diffidence of a man who was trying to take up less space than he was. He came to the gates on foot, having landed in a field 2 miles north and found them already open. Dumbledore was waiting on the path. The man was exactly as he'd imagined from the letter, enormously old, with the specific quality of authority that didn't need performance, wearing robes that would look absurd on anyone else and somehow didn't on him. He looked at Clark with those blue eyes and Clark looked back and they each took a moment to assess each other. "Mr. Kent," Dumbledore said. "Professor Dumbledore." Clark shook his hand. "Your letter was insufficient, I know," Dumbledore said. "I find that some things can't be prepared for with words." He gestured toward the castle. "Walk with me." They walked. The castle rose ahead of them in the evening, lit and alive, and Clark could hear, had been hearing since before the gate, his hearing having no polite setting when it chose to be engaged, the specific layered noise of several hundred children going about their evening. A building full of life, every kind of it. He was trying and failing not to listen for one specific heartbeat among them. "Tell me," he said to Dumbledore. "Tell me all of it." Dumbledore told him. The sequence of events Clark had never fully known, Lily and James Potter, the prophecy, Voldemort's attack at Godric's Hollow, the curse that had killed Lily and James and rebounded from Harry. The scar. The protection. The decade in Surrey with a family that, from Dumbledore's carefully worded description, Clark understood to have been catastrophically unsuitable. When Dumbledore said the cupboard under the stairs, Clark stopped walking. "The what?" he said. "I placed him there myself," Dumbledore said. "With the best, the cupboard." Clark's voice was very level. The levelness was doing significant work. "He grew up in a cupboard." "The intention, I'm going to need a moment," Clark said. He breathed in. Breathed out. The gate they'd passed through was 60 meters behind him and was very good iron, and he was not going to do anything to the gate. He was a man of extraordinary restraint, and the gate was innocent of all crimes. "He's here now," he said. "He's safe now." "Yes," Dumbledore said, "and remarkably well, all things considered." "What do you mean, remarkably well?" Dumbledore looked at him with those careful eyes. "Mr. Kent, the child who arrived here 3 weeks ago he is not the child I was expecting. I was expecting someone shaped by difficulty, someone who might need reconstruction. Instead, I found someone who had apparently used 11 years of neglect as an opportunity to become entirely himself." A pause. "He is quite something." Clark's chest did something complicated and warm and terrifying. "He knows. About himself? Not fully. He knows he's different. He's known it practically from birth. The Dursleys couldn't contain him and appear to have stopped genuinely trying some years ago." Dumbledore resumed walking, and Clark fell back into step. "He's been bending metal since he was 7, apparently." Clark thought about himself at 7. He thought about the barn wall he'd put his hand through. He thought about his mother's face, not afraid, never afraid, just carefully, determinedly calm, saying, "Clark, that's something special, honey. That's not something to be frightened of." Nobody had said that to Harry. The thought arrived with a sharpness that he felt in his back teeth. "Does he know about me?" Clark asked. "No," Dumbledore said. "I have told him there are things about his origins that I believe to be unusual." I was working up to a pause. "To be honest with you, Mr. Kent, I had a plan and Harry has somewhat exceeded its timeline. He asked me directly about his origins 2 weeks ago. I was not fully prepared." "How old is he again?" 11, Dumbledore said, and there was something in his tone that sounded almost like rueful admiration. "What did he say when you weren't fully prepared?" "He told me," Dumbledore smiled slightly. "He told me that he'd rather know what he was dealing with and that he wasn't going to break under information." Clark let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "He's mine," he thought. "That's mine. Not in possession, not in ownership, just in the terrifying, wonderful recognition of something. Sounds like he handled it better than you expected." "He handles everything better than expected," Dumbledore said, "which is either deeply reassuring or mildly terrifying depending on one's perspective." They had reached the castle entrance. The great doors were open and the warmth of the interior met them. Firelight and the smell of food and the specific acoustic quality of stone buildings full of living things. Clark looked up at the entrance hall, the staircases, the portraits moving in their frames, the ghost drifting through the far wall with the absolute comfort of something that had been doing this for 400 years. He'd spent time in this world before. He understood it, or understood it the way an outsider who'd done homework understood anything intellectually but not in his bones. "Where is he?" Clark asked. "At dinner," Dumbledore said. "In the Great Hall you can." He paused. "You can wait if you'd like. We have a guest room prepared, or I could bring him to my office after." "I can hear his heartbeat," Clark said. Dumbledore went still. "From here," Clark said. "I've been listening since the gate. I don't have a reference point for what his sounds like specifically, but there's one in there that's..." He stopped. The word he was looking for was familiar, but that wasn't quite right. It was closer to home. Different. Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. "Mr. Kent," he said quietly, "I owe both of you a great many apologies. I wonder if I might begin by stepping aside and letting the two of you find each other at your own pace." Clark nodded. "The Great Hall is straight through," Dumbledore said. "Second door on the left." Clark walked. Harry was explaining to Ron why his chess strategy had a fundamental structural flaw, specifically that Ron defaulted to aggressive opening gambits that worked brilliantly against players who were learning the pattern and failed against anyone who had already mapped it when he felt something change. Not in the room. In the air before the room. Something approaching that his body registered before his eyes did, the way it sometimes registered things, a quality of presence, something that felt like pressure without being pressure, like standing near something large and warm that you couldn't see. He looked up at the entrance to the Great Hall. A man stood there. He was tall, very tall, with dark hair and glasses, and the specific posture of someone who was deliberately making themselves smaller than they were. He wore ordinary clothes, not robes, which was already unusual. He was looking at the hall with an expression that Harry couldn't fully read from 40 meters away, but that contained something enormous in it. Then the man's eyes found Harry. Harry felt the impact of that eye contact the way you felt the impact of music, not as a thing you understood, but as a thing that moved through you before understanding arrived. He went completely still. Ron looked up from the board, then at Harry, then at the entrance. "Who's that?" "I don't know," Harry said. He was already getting up. Hermione, who had been reading beside the feast, looked up. "Harry, 2 minutes," Harry said, and he walked through the hall toward the entrance. The man was walking toward him at the same time. They met in the middle of the Great Hall. While hundreds of students ate around them and the enchanted ceiling showed a cold November sky, and Harry stopped 2 feet away and looked up at the man and felt the recognition hit him with the force of something that had been traveling toward him his entire life. The face. The jaw. The quality of the eyes behind the glasses, green, Harry's green, or close enough to make the difference meaningless. The quality of the stillness. Harry knew that quality. He'd spent 11 years being still in exactly that way, the stillness of someone managing something enormous and deciding constantly how much of it to let show. "Hi," the man said. His voice was careful and the carefulness was doing a great deal of work. "Hi," Harry said, a pause. "You're Clark Kent," Harry said. Something moved across the man's face. "You know, I started looking for information about my origins about 3 weeks ago," Harry said. "I found Dumbledore's letter on his desk when I went to return a book he'd borrowed from the library." Harry said this without apology. He'd been in Dumbledore's office with Dumbledore's knowledge, and the letter had been open on the desk, and he'd read it because it had his name in the second paragraph, and he was not in the habit of ignoring things with his name on them. "The letter had your name and your address, and it talked about my mother." Clark Kent stared at him. "You were going to tell me," Harry said. I work faster than people plan for." "I'm beginning to understand that," Clark said. They looked at each other in the middle of the Great Hall. Around them, the dinner noise had dropped by approximately 30% as the students at the surrounding tables registered that something was happening, the way students always registered when something interesting replaced the background hum of school life. "Can we go somewhere?" Harry asked. "To talk?" "Yes," Clark said. "Absolutely." Dumbledore's office had been made available, which Harry thought was a deliberate and somewhat diplomatic choice on Dumbledore's part, putting them in a space that was neutral for both of them, belonging to neither. There were portraits of previous headmasters on the walls, and they were all paying very close attention and trying to look like they weren't. Harry sat, Clark sat, a tea service appeared which neither of them touched. "You're my father," Harry said, not a question. Clark breathed out. "I believe so, yes. You knew my mother, for about 4 months, 12 years ago." Clark's voice was controlled, but the control was working against something genuine and raw underneath. "She came to Metropolis. He paused. "We were both things the world didn't have categories for, and I think that—" "She didn't tell you," Harry said. Clark's jaw tightened slightly. "No, she didn't. I found out," he stopped. "I found out she died, and I knew she'd had a child, and another stop. I told myself the child was James Potter's. It was the easier thing to believe. And then Dumbledore wrote to you, 3 weeks ago." Harry looked at him. Clark looked back. The glasses were, Harry had decided, some kind of affectation or disguise. The quality of the eyes behind them was the same quality as looking in a mirror, and not just the color, the structure, the particular way of seeing. He'd spent his whole life recognizing that quality in himself, and now he was looking at it in another person's face, and it felt like the ground had shifted slightly underfoot. Not destabilizing. "Just different." "What are you?" Harry asked. "Exactly." Clark blinked. "Most people ask who, not what." "I know who. I've read everything Dumbledore had in that file he's apparently been keeping. I want to know what, because I've been trying to figure out what I am for years, and I thought I'd start with the relevant source material." Clark looked at him for a long moment with the expression of someone encountering a style of directness they'd met before, but not in an 11-year-old. "I'm Kryptonian," he said, "from a planet called Krypton that doesn't exist anymore. I was sent here as an infant, and the sun gives you power," Harry said. "Yellow solar radiation absorbed by your cells. Strength, speed, flight, various sensory enhancements. You're effectively invulnerable under most conditions." A pause. "The weakness is kryptonite, radioactive fragments of your home planet. Green variety disrupts the solar energy in your cells." Clark stared at him. "Hermione helped me research," Harry said. "She thinks she was researching alien biology as a theoretical exercise. She's going to figure out I had a specific application in mind, probably by Thursday." He paused. "You don't need to look like that. I've known something was different about me since I was old enough to understand the word different. This just tells me what kind." "Harry, does the kryptonite thing apply to me?" Harry asked. "Because I've been trying to understand why magic doesn't behave around me the way it does around other people." Hermione says my spellwork outputs are genuinely inconsistent with my size and apparent experience, bigger than they should be, more responsive, more precise. And I've been wondering whether the Kryptonian biology is interacting with the magical energy in a specific way. Clark appeared to be having several thoughts simultaneously. He stopped. I genuinely don't know, nobody has ever, he made a small gesture. You're the only, this has never happened before, a Kryptonian and a witch. Having a child, Harry said, with both. Yes. Well, Harry said, and for the first time something in his voice shifted slightly from the collected clinical curiosity, something warmer moving underneath it, something that was 11 years old and had grown up in a cupboard and had never had a birthday cake until Hagrid. I suppose we'll figure it out. Clark looked at him. The expression on his face was the most complicated thing Harry had seen in a face, which was saying something because he'd been watching human expressions very carefully for 11 years. I didn't know about you, Clark said. I want you to understand that, if I had, I know, Harry said. You don't know what I would have, I know you would have come, Harry said. You came the moment you did know, within 3 weeks. A pause, that matters. The silence was different from the silences before. Something had changed in its quality, become less careful, less managed, more present. Can I? Clark started and stopped, and something in the stopping was so genuinely uncertain, so uncharacteristic for someone who was, by all accounts, one of the most powerful beings on the planet that Harry felt a warmth move through his chest. I don't know what you need from me, I don't want to make assumptions. I don't need anything specifically, Harry said. I'm doing well, he meant it, it was simply true. But he paused, and it was the first time he'd paused in the whole conversation, the first genuine hesitation. I'd like to know you if that's yes, Clark said. Yes, absolutely yes. Harry nodded, looked at his hands in his lap, back up. The cupboard, he said. Dumbledore put you in the file. I know. He felt guilty about it, I could tell from his face. He should, Clark said, and his voice had an edge it hadn't had before, something quietly incandescent in it. He absolutely should. I'm fine, Harry said. I managed. I know you managed, that's not, Clark stopped himself. You shouldn't have had to manage. Should have had, he stopped again, and Harry could see him deciding what not to say, choosing carefully. You're here now, you're safe, you're a breath, you're extraordinary. The word landed differently from how it had landed when teachers said it. Harry looked at Clark Kent across Dumbledore's desk and felt something settle in him that had been slightly, quietly, insufficiently anchored his entire life. So I'm told, he said, and his voice came out slightly rougher than intended. He cleared his throat. The Kryptonite question is still open. Clark let out a breath that was almost a laugh. Right, yes. He took off his glasses, rubbed them, put them back on. The gesture felt habitual, reflexive, a gesture that had nothing to do with the glasses and everything to do with having something to do with his hands. Harry recognized the impulse. My working theory is that your magic, he paused. This is speculation. Your magic might function as a secondary cellular energy source, like the yellow solar radiation, but internally generated. Meaning your cells aren't depleted of all energy sources the way mine are under kryptonite exposure. So the kryptonite disrupts solar energy, but the magic compensates, Harry said. Possibly, I'm not a scientist. I am, Harry said. Well, I'm 11. But functionally, he pulled out a notebook. He carried notebooks the same way Hermione did, which Ron had pointed out made them alarming in similar ways. I've been making notes. Could you look at these? Clark took the notebook. Read it. His expression moved through several phases. You've been doing this on your own, he said. Since 3 weeks ago when I found the letter, I've been reading everything I could find about alien biology and Kryptonian physiology specifically. There's a reasonable magical research library here, and Hermione helped with the theoretical framework without knowing why. Harry tapped the notebook. Kryptonite immunity question is the most urgent because I don't know whether anyone else might try to use it against me. But the broader question of how the biology interacts with the magic is urgent, Clark said quietly. He was looking at the notebook and then at Harry, and the expression was complicated and warm and had something in it that Harry recognized because he'd seen it once when Ron had talked about his family, belonging to something, wanting. I have a friend, Clark said. A very good friend with the most sophisticated scientific understanding on this planet, or possibly any planet. She'd love, he stopped. Would you mind if I brought her in? Her name is Diana. He paused, seeming to choose how to describe her. Very old and very wise, and she would take this seriously. Yes, Harry said, I'd like that. Outside, through Dumbledore's round window, the November night had gone full dark. The grounds were quiet. Somewhere in the school, Harry knew Ron was probably losing at chess to himself, and Hermione was probably rereading something she'd already underlined 3 times. I should go back, he said. My friends will wonder. Of course. Clark stood when Harry did, and there was a moment, brief, slightly awkward, where neither of them knew what to do with the physical space between them. Clark put out his hand and Harry shook it, and the handshake was more than a handshake in the specific way that some gestures carry more weight than their literal content. "I'll come back," Clark said. "If that's yes," Harry said, "come back." He picked up his notebook and moved toward the door, and then at the door he turned. "For what it's worth," he said, "you're what I thought you might be." Clark looked at him. "What do you mean?" "When I was working out who I was," Harry said, "I thought about what kind of person would have," he paused, choosing, "would have made someone like me, someone I could have come from." He looked at Clark steadily. "You're what I thought." He left before Clark could respond to that, because he'd said what he meant to say and had no interest in making it more complicated. And he walked back through the castle's nighttime corridors with the stone warm under his feet and the magic in the walls humming their familiar low frequency, and felt down under everything a new sound, a new note in the chord of himself, something that was also warm, also constant, the frequency of someone else. It didn't feel strange. It felt like completing a chord that had always had a gap in it. Ron was, in fact, playing chess against himself when Harry got back to the common room. Hermione was at the table with her ancient runes homework. They both looked up when he came in, clocked his face, and did the thing that made them, Harry thought, genuinely excellent humans. They waited. He sat down, took out his transfiguration essay, started writing. After about 2 minutes of this, Ron moved a chess piece and said casually to the board, "Good visit." "Yes," Harry said. "Good," Ron said equally casually. "Your queen's in danger, by the way." This was to his chess opponent, who was himself, which meant he was his own queen's danger. He appeared aware of this and not concerned. Hermione kept her eyes on her runes for approximately 6 more seconds and then, "Who was that man?" "My father," Harry said. The quill stopped. Hermione set it down carefully. "Harry, Clark Kent, he's a journalist, he lives in Metropolis." Harry kept writing. "Also, I'm half Kryptonian." The silence that followed was long enough that he looked up from his essay. Ron was staring at him with an expression of absolute blank processing, like a clock that had been wound too tight. Hermione had a very specific look on her face that Harry had come to recognize, the look that meant she was simultaneously shocked, fascinated, and already constructing research questions. "Kryptonian," she said. "As in, alien," Harry said. "Yes." "Superman," Ron said. His voice came out slightly higher than usual. "He doesn't use that name at school," Harry said. "He's Superman," Ron repeated as if repetition would make this compute. "He's also just a person," Harry said, "who's going to come back and visit. He paused. "I think he'd like to get to know me." Ron was still staring, then slowly something in his expression shifted past the shock and landed somewhere genuine and uncomplicated. "Okay," he said. "Good, that's Harry, that's actually brilliant." "Don't make it odd," Harry said. "I'm not making it odd, I'm just—" Ron looked at the ceiling. "My best friend is half Superman, Kryptonian." "There is not a meaningful difference to me right now," Ron said. Hermione had picked up her quill and put it down again twice. "Harry," she said very carefully. "If you're half Kryptonian and half magical, the interaction between those two, I know," Harry said. "The implications for your Kryptonite susceptibility alone, I know. I've been thinking about this, I know you have," Harry said with warmth. "I actually used your theoretical framework from last week's library session. I've got notes, we can work through it properly, but not tonight." Oh, she looked at him. Something in her expression was the kind of feeling that people tried to contain because expressing it would be embarrassing, but that was there regardless, a fierce, specific concern that was also something warmer than concern. "Are you all right?" she asked. Harry thought about the handshake, the notebook. "You're what I thought." "Yes," he said. "I'm yes." "Good," she said and picked up her quill again, and the common room settled back into its evening rhythm, and Harry finished his essay in 2 hours and went to bed and lay in the dark listening to the castle breathe. His father was asleep somewhere in the castle. His father who could fly, who had green eyes, who had taken off his glasses to rub them and put them back on, not because his eyesight needed them but because it was a thing his hands knew how to do. Harry pressed his fingers against the iron bed frame and felt it yield, soft as warm wax. He let himself smile at the ceiling. 2 of us, he thought. There are 2 of us. 2 days later, at Defense Against the Dark Arts, something happened that changed the temperature of the year. Quirrell was more erratic than usual, the stammer heavier, the notes more shuffled, the garlic stronger. He spent 20 minutes on the theory of magical protection wards, covering material Harry had read in September, and then he stopped mid-sentence. Just stopped. Harry looked up from his notes. Quirrell was standing at the front of the classroom with his back to them, facing the blackboard. His shoulders had shifted, not dropped, not hunched further, but changed. Straightened, stiffened, the way a body changes when something takes control of it. When he turned around, his eyes were wrong, not the soft, nervous, flickering eyes of the man who'd been teaching them for 2 months. These were still and dark and very, very focused. They moved through the classroom like something searching, and when they landed on Harry, they stopped. Harry held the gaze without moving. The thing behind Quirrell's eyes looked at Harry for exactly 4 seconds. Then Quirrell's whole body shuddered and the stammer came back and he dismissed the class 10 minutes early with a vagueness that felt like someone had cut some of the strings holding him up. In the corridor, Hermione immediately turned to Harry. "Did you see?" "Yes," Harry said. "His eyes were someone else's," Harry said. "Yes." Ron was looking back at the classroom door. "What does that mean?" Harry thought about the thing that had looked at him, the focused, evaluating quality of it. The specific manner of searching and the way the search had ended when it found him. "It means something knows I'm here," Harry said, "and is deciding what to do about it." "Something bad?" Ron asked. Harry considered the memory of those eyes, the intelligence in them, the patience. "Something that thinks it's winning," he said, "and has just found a variable it didn't account for." He walked down the corridor toward Transfiguration and didn't look back, but he was thinking very clearly and very fast, the way he thought when something required it, all the information he had, all the patterns of it, arranging themselves into a picture he didn't like but wasn't afraid of. Somewhere in this castle, or near it, something old and dark and very smart was looking at the board and recalculating. Harry was already 3 moves ahead. Chapter 4, Blood and Starlight. Clark came back on Saturday. He arrived the same way, on foot from the Northfield, no cape, glasses, the deliberate smallness of the Clark Kent posture, but this time Harry was waiting at the gate. He'd felt him coming from the Quidditch pitch where he'd been running early morning drills, felt that specific resonance in the air, and had come down and leaned against the stone pillar of the gate with his hands in his pockets, and watched Clark come up the path through the cold morning fog. Clark stopped a few feet away and looked at him. "You knew I was coming." "I felt it," Harry said. "You make a specific kind of impression on the air. I don't know how to explain it better than that." Clark considered this. "I felt you too from the field." A pause, like a second heartbeat. Harry nodded. That matched. He'd noticed the same thing when Clark was within a certain distance. His own chest carried an echo, like 2 instruments tuned to adjacent notes creating a harmonic. They walked toward the castle in the early quiet, frost on the grass, the grounds still empty of students. Clark moved differently on this visit, still the Kent posture but slightly less managed, the way people relaxed once the first difficult conversation was behind them. "Diana is coming next weekend," Clark said. "If that's still..." "Yes," Harry said. "Hermione's already prepared about 40 questions." "You told your friend about..." "She figured out most of it herself," Harry said. "I gave her the research notes I'd been making and by the next morning she'd sent me a list of hypotheses. The one about magical energy functioning as a tertiary cellular power source alongside solar radiation is hers. It's probably the most elegant framing." Clark looked at him sideways with an expression that kept happening, this involuntary, slightly undone quality, like he'd prepared for a certain kind of encounter and kept finding something different. "How long did it take her to figure out?" 2 days, she's exceptional." Harry paused. "She's going to want to run tests. On you or me? Both probably. Don't look alarmed, she's very precise." "I'm not alarmed, I just a 12-year-old wants to run scientific tests on Superman." 11, Harry said. "I'm 11. "Somehow that's worse," Clark said. Harry smiled. They walked through the castle entrance into the warmth of the interior, and Clark looked at the moving portraits and the floating candles with the interest of someone who'd been here before and was still finding new things to register. A ghost drifted through the wall ahead of them, and Clark tracked it with the specific attention of someone whose visual acuity was as impolite as Harry's own. "The nearly headless Nick," Harry said. "Gryffindor house ghost, mostly harmless. His head is nearly but not entirely detached, which is apparently a significant bureaucratic issue in the ghost community. The ghost community has bureaucracy. The ghost community has everything humans have," Harry said, "just more existential about it." Clark let out a genuine laugh, short, surprised, and Harry filed the sound away with the automatic precision with which he filed everything. They found an empty classroom on the 2nd floor, one of the spare rooms that wasn't used on Saturday mornings. Clark conjured 2 chairs by the simple expedient of moving the existing furniture with a consideration for Harry's comfort that was entirely unconscious and rather told. Harry sat on a desk instead. Clark took the chair, which was too small for him, and managed it with the practiced accommodation of a very tall man in a world sized for shorter people. "I want to understand what happened with Quirrell," Harry said. "What Voldemort actually is, not the legend, the mechanism." Clark was quiet for a moment. "Dumbledore briefed me last night." "What did he say?" "That Voldemort is effectively a fragmented consciousness, capable of possession. That he's been weakened to a point approaching non-existence, but is searching for a path back to a physical form." Clark looked at him steadily. "He's using Quirrell as a host." "For now," Harry said, "that's not a sustainable arrangement. He needs something more stable or a direct resurrection, which means there's an objective he's working toward in this school." He thought about the layout of the castle, the restricted sections, the things he'd been reading about over the past month that had seemed like interesting diversions and were now reorganizing into a pattern. The third-floor corridor, there's something there. Clark looked at him. How do you know about? Dumbledore warned us about it the first night, specifically, in those exact tones that experienced authority figures use when they want to simultaneously tell children not to go somewhere and pique their curiosity enough that the children think about going there constantly. Harry tilted his head slightly. There's something valuable being kept there, possibly something that could help Voldemort. The Kryptonian in me says we go look at it. The Hogwarts student in me says we're not supposed to. And which one wins? I've already looked, Harry said. Clark stared at him. Cerberus, Harry said, three-headed dog. Called Fluffy, apparently I read Hagrid's name for it in a note on Dumbledore's desk. Trapdoor underneath, something below the trapdoor that's worth guarding with a monstrous animal. He looked at Clark. I didn't go down, I'm not reckless, but I wanted to know what we were dealing with. When, Thursday, 2 in the morning, the castle's very quiet and the third-floor door doesn't have a particularly sophisticated locking charm. He met Clark's eyes calmly. I'm not going to pretend I didn't do things outside the rules, but I'm also not going to pretend the rules were the relevant consideration. Clark looked at him for a long time. The expression was complicated, there was concern in it, and something that might have been parental instinct deploying itself in real time and not quite knowing its own shape yet. You could have been hurt, he said. No, Harry said, not arrogantly, just accurately. I couldn't have been, not by a large dog, three-headed or otherwise. He paused. The more relevant point is that something down there is what Voldemort wants, and if he gets it while I'm busy following school rules, the consequences are significantly worse than a note to Professor McGonagall. You're 11, Clark said. It wasn't quite a protest. It was more like a man reminding himself of a fact that kept being undermined by evidence. So you keep saying, Harry said. You're very 11, Clark said. You're the most 11 person I've ever met who keeps making me feel like the least qualified adult in the room. Harry looked at him steadily. You're not unqualified, you're just not used to your child being able to keep up. The word child landed between them with a weight that was different from the way Harry usually chose words. Something in it was deliberate, not a claim, not a demand, but an acknowledgement offered cleanly and without ceremony. Clark went very still for a moment. Then, no, he said quietly. I'm not used to that. They sat with that for a moment. Diana, Clark said eventually, she'd have thoughts on the Voldemort situation specifically. She's encountered things like this before, fragmented consciousness possession. She's encountered most things, Clark said. She's 3,000 years old. Harry paused. 3,000, give or take. She's going to have thoughts on quite a lot of things, Harry said. She's going to have thoughts on you specifically, Clark said. I told her about you. Something shifted in his expression. She said, and I'm quoting, Clark, you've been carrying everything alone your whole life. I'm not surprised the universe found a way to give you someone to carry it with. Harry considered this. I like her already. Everyone likes Diana, Clark said. It's somewhat ridiculous how much everyone likes Diana. Ron found them in the empty classroom at 8:30 when he came looking for Harry with the urgent news that Fred and George had somehow acquired a fanged frisbee and were deploying it in the corridor outside the common room, and McGonagall's office was only 2 floors up. He opened the door, clocked Harry, clocked the very large man sitting in the small chair, and stood in the doorway for a moment while his brain did its loading procedure. Ron Weasley, Harry said. This is Clark Kent. Ron's eyes went briefly to Clark's face, briefly to his jaw, briefly to his eyes, and then to Harry, and something in his expression indicated that the visual similarity had processed and the implications were computing. He looked back at Clark. Right, Ron said, in the voice of someone being very normal. Hi, Clark said. Something in his expression went slightly warmer. Ron's one of my 2 closest friends, Harry said. He already knows most of it. You can be yourself. Clark looked between them and then carefully straightened in the small chair just slightly, just enough that the Kent posture dropped a fraction and the actual Clark beneath it came through. Ron registered this change the way Harry had, with the instinctive recognition of someone who'd grown up around people who hid things, the sense of something large being briefly acknowledged. Your family's in the Order of the Phoenix, Clark said. Arthur Weasley, I've corresponded with him. He's been a reliable contact in the magical world for years. Ron stared. You know my dad, we've never met. But I've read his work on magical artifact detection and quoted it in 3 pieces I wrote for the Daily Planet about the intersection of magical and non-magical technology. Clark paused. I've always thought he was genuinely brilliant. Ron's expression, which had been doing various complicated things, settled somewhere into the specific warmth that his father's name reliably produced in him. He is, he said. He's absolutely mad about Muggle stuff. He'd completely lose it if he knew. He stopped, looked at Harry. Your dad corresponds with my dad. Apparently, Harry said, about magical artifact detection. It seems so. Ron sat down on a desk next to Harry and looked at Clark with the frank, direct attention he deployed when something genuinely interested him rather than alarmed him. So what are you going to do about, he glanced at Harry, the thing we don't name? I'm working on that, Clark said. Harry's already gone to the third floor, Ron said. I know. He told you, just now. Ron turned to Harry. Did you tell him about the chess game theory? Harry had, in fact, developed a theory over the past week that Voldemort's strategy resembled a chess endgame. Specifically the kind of endgame where one player had fewer pieces but superior position, and was engineering specific exchanges to maximize that positional advantage. He'd laid it out for Ron over a chessboard on Thursday evening as a way of thinking through the logic, and Ron, who was genuinely exceptional at chess in a way that sat interestingly alongside his general self-deprecation, had spent 40 minutes poking holes in the theory and 3 separate times produced a counterpoint that Harry had incorporated. Not yet, Harry said. Tell him. Ron blinked. You want me to? You're better at the spatial reasoning parts, Harry said honestly. You think in board positions naturally, I think in patterns, they're different things. Ron looked at him with the expression of someone who'd been handed something unexpectedly and wasn't sure what to do with it. Then he squared up and looked at Clark Kent and said, right, so the way I see it, Voldemort's playing a positional game, and laid it out with the natural fluency of someone talking about something they understood in their bones. Clark listened. He listened completely, the way Harry had noticed he did, the full quality of it, no part of his attention in reserve. When Ron finished, Clark said, the endgame analysis is accurate but you've missed a piece. Ron straightened slightly. Which piece? Harry, Clark said. He doesn't have Harry in his model. He knew the prophecy child survived, but he doesn't know what Harry is. He's playing a board he hasn't fully seen yet. Ron and Harry looked at each other. Which means, Harry said slowly, that when Quirrell looked at me on Thursday, he started to see it, Clark said, and he pulled back. Which means Voldemort is now revising his model. He's going to move faster, Ron said. If he thinks he's got a timeline problem, he'll accelerate toward whatever's under that trapdoor, Harry finished. To Clark, we need to know what it is. I know what it is, Clark said. Dumbledore told me last night. They both looked at him. The Philosopher's Stone, Clark said. It produces the elixir of life, indefinite life extension. For someone in Voldemort's current state, a physical resurrection, Harry said. Not just possession, a real body sustained by the elixir. He wouldn't need a host. He thought about this fast and complete. He'd need a body to start with, a ritual. This isn't happening in the next 2 weeks, it's too complex, but it's happening this year. Dumbledore believes so, Clark said. What does Dumbledore plan to do about it? Clark paused. He believes the protections are sufficient. Harry looked at him. Do you believe that? The pause was longer this time. No, Clark said. Neither do I, Harry said. Diana Prince arrived the following Saturday. Harry saw her coming across the grounds from his window perch at 6 in the morning, a tall woman with dark hair and an easy, precise stride, moving through the morning fog with the manner of someone who owned every ground they walked on without needing to announce it. She wore ordinary clothes, dark and simple, and carried nothing. She looked like a person the way Clark looked like a person, technically accurate and insufficient. She was with Clark, who had come the night before and stayed in the guest room. They were talking as they walked, something easy and old in the dynamic between them, the conversation of people who had seen each other through things that left residue. Harry went down to meet them at the castle entrance. Diana looked at him when he came through the doors, and her expression was different from the expressions he'd been cataloging, not the recalibration of teachers encountering something beyond their expectation. Not the raw, complicated warmth of Clark's ongoing adjustment. Diana's expression was the look of someone who had been told about a thing and was now confirming that the telling was accurate. Harry Potter, she said. Diana Prince, Harry said. She smiled. It was a very good smile, genuine, direct, slightly amused. Clark told me you read fast. He told me you're 3,000 years old. Give or take, she said, which was exactly what Clark had said, and Harry registered the specific comfort of a phrase shared so long it had become automatic. They found an empty room, a larger one this time, Dumbledore having apparently arranged things, and the 3 of them sat, and Hermione arrived 12 minutes later with her notebook and the slightly breathless quality of someone who had run the last 3 corridors. She stopped in the doorway, took in Diana, took in Clark, pulled her notebook more firmly to her chest. Miss Granger, Clark said, which meant Dumbledore had briefed him further. I've heard a great deal about your research. Hermione looked at Harry. I showed him the hypotheses, Harry said, the tertiary cellular power source framework specifically. That's my framework, she said, not accusingly, just precisely. I know, that's why I told him it was yours. She looked at Diana. Are you also demigod? Diana said with complete ease. My father was Zeus. Hermione sat down. They spent 4 hours working through the theoretical framework of Harry's biology. Diana's contribution was to the magical theory end. She had spent 3,000 years in a world adjacent to magic without being magical herself, and had the observational data of someone who had watched from the outside with excellent eyes and perfect memory. She described what she'd seen of magical energy in a way that made Hermione's notebook fill up at approximately twice its usual pace. Clark worked through the Kryptonian biology elements, patient and precise, and Harry noticed slightly more relaxed than he'd been on either previous visit. The relaxation had a specific quality. It was the relaxation of someone who had something to do, something useful, a problem to engage with rather than just a situation to navigate emotionally. Harry sat and answered questions, and asked more than he answered, and ate the substantial breakfast he'd brought from the kitchens, because 4 hours of intensive thought required fuel, and he was constitutionally incapable of thinking on an empty stomach. Ron sat in the corner and read his Quidditch magazine and occasionally asked a question that was much sharper than the Quidditch magazine implied he was paying attention to. The conclusion by noon was this: Harry's magic did not merely coexist with his Kryptonian cellular biology. It had fully integrated with it. The solar energy storage in his cells was supplemented and in certain conditions supplanted by magical energy, creating a closed loop that was self-sustaining in ways neither system was independently. Kryptonite radiation, which disrupted the solar energy storage specifically, had no interaction pathway with the magical energy system. "You're immune," Diana said, flatly, conclusively, as if this were simply a fact requiring acknowledgement rather than a revelation. "Not resistant, immune." "That's what I thought," Harry said. "The implications are..." Hermione stopped, rewound, started again. "The implications for your power levels are significant. You're not drawing on one system at a time, they enhance each other constantly." "Does that mean..." Clark started. "He's likely stronger than you," Diana said to Clark, not cruelly, not unkindly, just accurately. Clark looked at Harry, Harry looked back at him. "Probably," Harry said. "I've never tested a ceiling, I haven't needed to." A pause. "Also, I'm 11. "You keep saying that," Diana said. "Why do you keep saying that? People keep seeming surprised by things I've done, and I thought contextualizing with age might help." "It doesn't help," she said. "It just makes the things more surprising." "Fair," Harry agreed. Clark was looking at him with an expression that was somehow both deeply proud and deeply, specifically terrified. Harry recognized the combination. It was the expression of someone who had realized the thing they were most responsible for protecting was the thing least in need of protection, and was trying to figure out what that meant for the relationship. "I don't need protecting," Harry said, because he might as well say it. "No," Clark agreed. "You don't?" A pause. "I still would like to, though, if that's..." "Yes," Harry said. "I know." He looked at his notebook. "It's mutual." The afternoon after, when Hermione had gone to the library to start processing the morning's findings, and Diana had gone walking with Ron, who had apparently decided, with the straightforward practicality that was one of his best qualities, that Diana Prince was interesting and deserved to be shown the lake, Clark and Harry sat in the emptied room, and Clark said, "Can I ask you something that isn't about biology?" "Go ahead." "The Dursleys." Clark said the name with the specific flatness of someone managing their tone carefully. "How, what was it like?" Harry looked at him. "Why do you want to know?" "Because I didn't know," Clark said. "And I feel..." He stopped, checked himself, started again. "I feel responsible. I know technically I didn't know. I know I can't have..." "You can't be responsible for something you didn't know was happening," Harry said. "I know that. I also feel responsible. They're separate things." Harry thought about this. He found it accurate, the logic of guilt not requiring logic, running on different tracks from the logic of culpability. He'd thought about this himself, lying in the cupboard as a younger child, trying to understand why his aunt and uncle behaved the way they did, and finding that logic didn't map cleanly onto cruelty. "It wasn't good," he said, plainly. "The cupboard was small and cold. I didn't have things other children had. Dudley had everything, and I had what was left over when he got bored of something." He paused. "Vernon was afraid of me, not afraid of me specifically, afraid of what I represented. Something his wife couldn't look at without flinching. He made that my problem." Clark's jaw was tight. "I managed," Harry said. "I want to be clear that I genuinely managed. Not despite who I am because of it. I was never small inside it, even when the space was small." He looked at Clark steadily. "But it was a long time to go without anyone who..." He stopped. "Without anyone who what?" Clark said. The pause was brief and genuine. "Without anyone who made me feel like what I was right," Harry said. "Normal people made me feel like I was too much somehow, even before I understood the half of it." He looked at his hands. "You don't make me feel like too much." Clark breathed in, out. His voice when he spoke was very level, with the levelness doing significant work. "You're not too much," he said. "You're exactly right." Harry nodded once. Looked back at his notebook. "Do you want to go outside?" Clark said. "The grounds look..." "Yes," Harry said. "Yes, let's go." They walked the grounds in the afternoon cold, Clark with his hands in his jacket pockets and Harry with his in his school robes, and they didn't talk about anything important for a while. Clark asked about Quidditch and Harry explained the rules properly, and Clark listened with genuine interest and asked the kind of questions that revealed a mind that enjoyed the strategic dimension of sport rather than just its spectacle. He asked about Ron and Harry told him about the chessboard by the lake and the sandwich sharing on the train, and the way Ron could make a room feel more like a room just by being in it. He asked about Hermione and Harry said she was the most genuinely rigorous thinker he'd met, which was saying something, and that she was also sometimes so certain she was right that she needed someone to push back, and that Harry pushed back and she was getting better at appreciating it rather than resisting it. Clark smiled at this. She sounds like Lois. Lois Lane, your colleague, my partner, Clark said. My pause, Lois. Harry looked at him sideways. Does Lois know about you? Yes, Clark said. She figured it out. She was the first person who, he paused in the way of someone realizing something in real time. She was the first person who didn't make me feel like too much. Harry looked at him. Clark looked back. Right, Harry said. Right, Clark agreed. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, past the lake, past the edge of the forbidden forest, the trees dark and close and full of old noise. The sun was going down early in the November way, the sky going orange and pink above the castle throwing a long shadow across the frost. I'm going to be here more, Clark said. I've cleared my schedule. Dumbledore has agreed I can come and go as needed. You don't need Dumbledore's agreement, Harry said. No, Clark said, but he needs mine if I'm going to be helpful rather than he made a gesture. I need to work with him, not around him. And if he makes decisions you disagree with, then I tell him I disagree with them, Clark said, directly and clearly. Good, Harry said. He responds to that better than he lets on. He's used to people deferring to him. I imagine he is, Clark said. I'm not going to do that. Neither am I, Harry said. I know, Clark said, and the smile was back, the genuine one that reached the corners. The Quidditch season's first match was 3 days later, Gryffindor versus Slytherin, which was the fixture that guaranteed the highest local temperature in terms of student engagement. Oliver Wood had been preparing since August by his own account, and had been preparing since their first practice by Harry's observation. And the morning of the match, he gathered the team in the changing room with the focused intensity of a man who had prepared for exactly this moment. Harry sat and listened to the tactical briefing with genuine attention. Wood was actually quite good. His analysis of Slytherin's playing style was thorough. His understanding of positional advantage on the pitch was sophisticated, and his assessment of the opposing seeker, Marcus Flint, a sixth-year built like a battering ram, was balanced between respect for his physical capability and appropriate confidence in Harry's speed advantage. Flint is bigger, stronger, and has 5 years on you, Wood said. He will attempt to physically intimidate you on the pitch. Standard stuff from Slytherin. How often does it work? Harry asked. Against most seekers, reasonably often, Wood looked at him. I don't think it'll work on you. No, Harry agreed. They flew out into the November cold, and the roar of the crowd hit them from both directions, Gryffindor red on one side, Slytherin green on the other, the two ends of the stadium competing in volume. Harry flew a slow circuit of the pitch on his Nimbus 2000, the broom Dumbledore had somehow arranged for him, a top-of-the-line machine that responded to him like a second skin, and felt the familiar, perfect rightness of the air under him. Madam Hooch released the snitch. It vanished in under a second. Harry watched the space where it had been and let his attention open up completely, not focused on any particular point, but wide, taking in the whole pitch in the particular way his vision allowed. He could see everything simultaneously. The quaffle moving between players, the bludgers tracing their arcs, the crowd's color and motion, Marcus Flint circling the opposite end with his eyes on Harry rather than the space where the snitch might be. That was information. Flint was playing the seeker before the snitch. Good, it meant he'd be in exactly the wrong position when Harry moved. Harry tracked a flash of gold, something peripheral and fast, near the Slytherin goal posts. His body moved before the conscious decision arrived, a full-pitch dive at angles that made the crowd noise change pitch, and he heard from Gryffindor's side a sound like a collective intake of breath, and from the commentary box Lee Jordan's voice climbed 2 octaves. Flint saw him move and came after him. He was big and fast and the broom was good and he came in hard from the right, clearly intending to cut Harry off with body contact that would have sent a smaller rider sideways. Harry went under him. Not past, not around, under, dropping the Nimbus 6 feet in the split second before contact, Flint passing over him close enough that the air from his broom was a gust. And Harry was already climbing again on the other side, already reaching, the snitch visible now at 3 meters, 2 meters. He closed his fist around it at full speed and wheeled the broom in a tight arc and held the struggling gold thing up. Silence. 1 second of absolute silence across the entire pitch. Then the Gryffindor stands erupted. Harry brought the broom down at a leisurely pace, snitch in hand, and landed on the grass and became immediately buried under 5/6 of the Gryffindor Quidditch team. Wood was making a sound Harry hadn't heard a human make before. In the stands, Ron was standing on his seat, which he'd share later was the most physically committed he'd ever been to anything, and Hermione was gripping Neville's arm hard enough to leave marks, which she apologized for later. From the Slytherin stands, there was silence of a specific quality. And from the Slytherin team captain, Marcus Flint, there was a look, not just anger but something more considered, the look of someone recalculating. Harry clocked it, filed it, didn't particularly care. He looked up at the stands and found Clark in the visitor section, the teacher's end, where Dumbledore had apparently arranged a seat, standing very still among the celebrating crowd, and the expression on his face was the one Harry was still learning to read because he'd never had a reason to learn it before. Pride. Uncomplicated, complete, slightly overwhelmed. Harry held up the snitch briefly in his direction. Clark's face did something that his Clark Kent face wasn't designed to contain. Harry pocketed the snitch and went to shake Wood's hand before the man actually cried in front of the team. That evening, walking back from the celebration that had taken over the Gryffindor common room, Fred and George had produced something called butter beer from somewhere. Ron had eaten an impossible quantity of crisps, and the singing had been earnest if not technically accomplished. Harry found Quirrell in the corridor outside the 3rd floor. Not the Quirrell who stammered and shuffled. The other one. Quirrell was standing at the door to the 3rd floor corridor with his back to Harry, very still, his hand on the handle. He hadn't heard Harry coming, almost no one did. Harry stopped 10 feet behind him and said clearly, "Professor Quirrell." Quirrell spun. His face went through several things in quick succession, shock, recognition, and then something that went very still and very focused in the way Harry had seen it in the Dada classroom, the other thing looking out. "Potter," it said through Quirrell's mouth. The stammer was entirely absent. "You're going to want to step away from that door," Harry said, a silence. "Brave child," it said. The voice was something that didn't belong to a living person, layered and cold and with a quality of age that was enormous and very, very old. "Do you know what I am?" "Yes," Harry said. "You're Lord Voldemort in a borrowed body. You want what's behind that door, you're not getting it tonight." "Not tonight," Voldemort agreed through Quirrell's mouth with the ease of something that was not operating on a human timeline. "But I am curious about you, Harry Potter. You are a pause, the kind that carried genuine consideration in it, not what I expected." "I know," Harry said. "What were you expecting? A frightened boy." The voice was almost pleasant. "A boy shaped by difficulty and loss, a boy I could frighten further." A pause. "Instead I find," another pause. "What are you exactly?" Harry looked at the thing wearing Quirrell's face. The deep, ancient intelligence behind it, real intelligence, he acknowledged it as that, the kind that had planned and executed for decades and built something formidable from nothing. "Not a fool, not something to be underestimated. Something you haven't seen before," Harry said, "and that should concern you." "It intrigues me," Voldemort said. "There's a difference." "For now," Harry said, the silence stretched. They were both completely still, 10 feet apart in the stone corridor, the school asleep around them. "Step away from the door," Harry said again. Same tone, same steadiness. Quirrell's body turned. The hand left the handle. Voldemort, through Quirrell's eyes, looked at Harry for a long moment with something that was calculating and patient and deeply focused. "We will speak again," it said. "We will," Harry agreed. "And I'd like you to understand something before we do." He looked at the thing behind the eyes. "I know what you are and I know what you want and I know how you work. I'm not afraid of you. I'm not going to be afraid of you, and you should factor that into your planning." A pause. "How refreshing," Voldemort said. And then Quirrell walked away down the corridor, unhurried, and turned the corner and was gone. Harry stood in the empty corridor for a moment. He looked at the 3rd floor door. Then he went to find Clark. Chapter 5. The Kryptonite Gambit. The owl arrived at 3 in the morning. Harry was already awake. He slept less than most people and used the quiet hours the way other people use daylight, sitting at the dormitory window with his notebook open, working through the implication matrix he'd been building around Voldemort's likely next moves. The owl came in through the window he'd left cracked precisely for this possibility, because Clark had told him 2 days ago that he was working a source in the non-magical world who had intelligence about unusual materials purchases, and that he'd send word the moment anything developed. The letter was short. "Harry, Kryptonite, someone has been acquiring fragments through non-magical channels significant quantities over the past 3 weeks. The buyer used shell companies, but the acquisition pattern is consistent with someone who knows exactly what they're looking for. I've identified 3 possible sources. One of them leads to a name, Lucius Malfoy. I'm coming tomorrow morning. Tell no one else yet." See, Harry read the letter twice, folded it, sat very still for a moment. Then he picked up his notebook and wrote 3 words at the top of a clean page: Lucius Malfoy, Kryptonite. He wrote under that for an hour. By the time the castle began its early morning sounds, he had 4 pages and a theory he didn't like but couldn't dismiss, and when the dormitory began stirring, he closed the notebook, tucked it under his mattress and went down to breakfast looking entirely ordinary. Hermione arrived at the table and looked at him immediately. She always looked at him immediately. "You've been thinking since before 4 a.m., she said. This was not a question. How do you know? You have a specific look that you only have when you've been thinking for hours. Your posture is very slightly different. You can read my posture. You've been reading everyone's posture since September," she said. "Did you think it wouldn't work in reverse?" Ron arrived and sat down and started loading his plate. "What did I miss?" "Harry got a letter at 3 a.m., Hermione said. "Hermione," Harry said. "Ron is in this as much as either of us," she said. "You know that." Harry looked at Ron, who had paused with a forkful of egg and was waiting with the particular quality of complete willingness that was one of his most underrated characteristics. He wasn't asking to be included. He was simply already in it and waiting for the information to catch up. "Clark's coming this morning," Harry said low. "There's a development. Wait until he's here." They both nodded. Hermione went back to her toast with the controlled energy of someone sitting on a significant amount of curiosity. Ron finished his eggs and poured himself more orange juice and said, at normal volume, "Gryffindor beat Hufflepuff in the practice match yesterday. George said Angelina flew beautifully." Harry let the conversation normalize around them. He ate and talked and watched the Slytherin table across the hall, specifically Draco Malfoy, who was eating with the self-contained quality of someone who knew something and was enjoying knowing it. He'd thought about Malfoy carefully since the Quirrell encounter. Draco was not stupid. Harry had given him full credit for that from the beginning, finding the performance of arrogance more interesting than its surface suggested. Underneath the posturing was a boy who understood power the way children of powerful people understood it, not as a tool to be earned but as an atmosphere to be breathed. He'd been taught that the world arranged itself around his family. What happened when that belief encountered something it couldn't arrange? Malfoy's eyes found Harry's across the hall. A beat, then Malfoy looked away. He was afraid. Not of Harry's magic, Harry thought, of something else, something he knew that Harry didn't know yet. Clark arrived at 8:15. Harry met him at the gate, Hermione and Ron with him. Clark looked at the three of them and then at Harry specifically, and something in his expression confirmed that the news was worse than the letter had suggested. They went to the empty classroom, 3rd floor, which had become their default. Clark stayed standing. He put the letter, a different letter longer, on ordinary paper on the desk and said, "Lex Luthor." Harry had read enough to know the name. He waited. "Lex Luthor is one of the most intelligent people alive," Clark said. "He's also someone who has spent the better part of a decade trying to find a way to neutralize me. Kryptonite is his primary weapon of choice and he's accumulated more of it than almost anyone." A pause. 2 months ago, he was approached by an intermediary. The intermediary wanted to know about Kryptonite's properties, specifically whether it could be synthesized into a form that would survive magical interference, whether it could be made into a weapon that worked inside magical spaces. "Voldemort's intermediary," Hermione said. "Lucius Malfoy," Clark said. "Yes." "So Voldemort knows about you," Harry said. "He knows about me, and he's worked out, or someone has worked out for him, that you might be Kryptonian. That a weapon that neutralizes Kryptonians might neutralize you." Clark looked at Harry. "Luthor said he doesn't cooperate with magical actors. He considers magic a wildcard he can't quantify, but the fact that someone asked him means the intelligence about your biology is circulating." "What did Luthor do with the information?" Hermione asked. "He started his own research," Clark said. "That's the more immediate problem. Luthor independently reached the same conclusion about Harry that we've been working toward. He's interested, very interested. A Kryptonian magical hybrid is the kind of thing Lex finds." He paused over the word compelling. "He wants to study me," Harry said. "He wants to acquire you," Clark said, and his voice had an edge Harry hadn't heard in it before. That's the word his source used, acquire. The room was quiet. Ron said, "Nobody's acquiring Harry." Clark looked at him. "No," he said, "they're not." "What does Luthor actually know?" Harry asked. He kept his voice level and analytical because this was the most productive mode, not because the information wasn't alarming, but because alarm was less useful than understanding. Specifically, what has he confirmed versus what is he working from inference? He's confirmed Kryptonian biology in your bloodline. He's inferred the magical component. He does not yet know whether the Kryptonite immunity hypothesis is correct. That's still theoretical for him. He's been trying to get Kryptonite into a form that could penetrate Hogwarts' magical barriers. Clark sat down. "My source says he has a sample, a modified sample treated with a suppression compound he's been developing. He thinks it might work against you even if standard Kryptonite doesn't." Hermione already had her notebook out. "Modified how?" He calls it K-Red. "The standard green Kryptonite disrupts solar energy absorption. K-Red supposedly also disrupts the body's secondary energy processing, the theory being that if it shuts down both solar and magical energy pathways simultaneously, the immunity becomes irrelevant. Hermione was writing rapidly. Harry watched her hand and thought about the hypothesis. He mapped it against what Diana had explained about the cellular integration. If the two systems were genuinely unified, not parallel but fused, then targeting them separately would be like trying to separate the warp and weft of fabric by pulling on one thread. The fabric didn't come apart, the thread did. It won't work, Harry said. You're sure? Clark asked. Based on what Diana explained, the integration runs too deep. He'd need to disrupt both systems simultaneously at the cellular level simultaneously with perfect calibration. The interference patterns would cancel each other out. He paused. But he's intelligent enough to eventually figure that out and try something more sophisticated. This isn't the last version of this problem. No, Clark agreed. It isn't. So we have two concurrent threats, Hermione said, with the tone of someone organizing information because organization made it manageable. Voldemort, who wants the stone and is using Quirrell as a vessel, and Luther, who is apparently now aligned with Voldemort's interests even if not directly working with him. Aligned is generous, Clark said. It's more that their objectives have a temporary overlap. Luther wants Harry neutralized so he can be studied. Voldemort wants the stone. Their common ground is removing obstacles, specifically me. If Luther can make a weapon that works on Kryptonians, Voldemort gets me out of the picture. He looked at Harry. Both problems lead back to the same junction point. The stone, Harry said. Voldemort moves on the stone and triggers everything else. He thought through the timing. He'll move soon. He's been watching me since the Dada class. He knows I'm a variable he hasn't quantified yet, and the longer he waits, the worse his information advantage gets. He looked up. We need to go down to what's under that trapdoor. Harry, Clark started. Not to fight, Harry said. To understand the protections, to know the terrain before it matters. He looked at Clark. Would you rather I go down there with you knowing the layout, or would you rather we find out what's down there when Voldemort's already in it? Clark looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Hermione and Ron. All three of us, Hermione said before anyone asked. Obviously. Obviously, Ron confirmed. He cracked his knuckles, which was his way of preparing for things, and Harry found it genuinely endearing. Tonight, Harry said, late, Clark comes with us. He looked at Clark. You've been in tighter spaces than a trapdoor. Once or twice, Clark said. They went down at 2 in the morning. Harry first, then Hermione with a wand light, then Ron, then Clark last. Clark, who had to angle himself through the trapdoor at a creative angle due to the width of his shoulders, but made no complaint about it. Fluffy was asleep. Not naturally asleep, Harry had brought a small magical music box he'd found in the library's restricted reading on magical creatures, winding it softly before they opened the door, and the three-headed dog had dropped its 3 heads by the time they crossed the threshold. He'd read about this. He'd read about almost everything down here because the protections Dumbledore and the teachers had designed were all things with library entries if you knew where to look. The trapdoor was open. Harry went first, dropping through into the dark, landing without sound. He caught Hermione when she came down, then Ron, then Clark, who landed with a contained impact that was impressively light for someone his size. Wand light, stone walls, the devil's snare stretching lazily in the dark below them, already reaching. Don't panic, Harry said. Relax completely, it can't hold something that isn't struggling. He let himself go entirely still, and the plant's tendrils, finding nothing to grip, withdrew. Hermione had already relaxed, she'd read the same thing. Ron managed it with visible effort, and the expression of someone whose instincts were pointing in the exact opposite direction. Clark stood in the plant's grip with the absolute calm of a man who was not capable of being constrained by vegetation and waited for it to get bored. They moved forward. The key chamber was full of winged keys, hundreds of them darting and circling near the ceiling. Harry looked at them for approximately 3 seconds, spotted the old one with the damaged wing, the specific one, the one that had been caught before, and showed the evidence of it, and rose on his broomstick, and had it before the chamber's logic had finished being impressed with itself. The chess chamber was different. Harry stood at the entrance and looked at the giant board, the pieces carved from stone, human scale, the kind that moved and attacked. Ron's face changed when he saw it. He went from 17 different kinds of apprehensive to something that was almost serene. This one's mine, Ron said. Harry looked at him. Chess is mine, Ron said, with the matter-of-fact quality of someone stating a professional qualification. You've got everything else, let me have this one. Harry stepped back. It's yours. Ron studied the board for 90 seconds. His eyes moved, tracking, calculating, doing the thing Harry had watched him do at the lake and across various game boards over the past months, seeing the board not as static positions but as a system of force and vector, potential and resolution. Then he said, I need to be the knight. Harry, you're the bishop. Hermione, castle. Clark, he looked at Clark. Can you be a pawn? Clark looked at his own very large shadow on the floor and the very large stone pawn beside him. I'll manage. The moment the game moves, don't. Ron stopped himself, looked at Clark. You can't be hurt by the pieces. Not significantly, Clark said. Okay, then you're bait, Ron said. I need the opposing queen to commit to you, Clark said. I've been used as bait before. Was it by an 11-year-old? No, that's a new one. The game took 12 minutes. Ron moved them through it with a clarity and authority that transformed him completely. He wasn't nervous or self-deprecating or working in anyone else's shadow. He was entirely himself, the most capable version of himself, occupying exactly the right space. When the queen came for him, because Ron had built the gambit around himself as sacrifice, positioning himself perfectly to end the game in the same move, Harry moved without being told and blocked. Ron looked at him. You're not sacrificing yourself, Harry said. Figure out a different line. Harry, the position, find another line, Harry said, level and calm. You're better than a one-option board. Ron stared at the pieces for 4 more seconds. Something shifted in his expression, not resentment, but something sharpening beyond it, rising to a challenge. His eyes tracked the board again, and Harry watched him see it, the moment it arrived, the new sequence that hadn't existed until someone refused to accept the first answer. Castle takes bishop, Ron said. The castle moved. The king toppled. The pieces stood down. Ron let out a breath and sagged slightly against the nearest standing piece. Harry put a hand on his shoulder briefly as they passed. Better, Harry said. You knew there was another line, Ron said. I thought there probably was, Harry said. You're the one who found it. The troll chamber was already dealt with, unconscious and not by their doing, which meant someone had been here recently. Harry noted this and moved them through quickly. The potion chamber was Hermione's. She had the logic table solved in under 2 minutes, read it aloud while Harry and Clark checked the bottles, and directed them to the correct one with the absolute confidence of someone in their element. Then they were through. The final chamber was a mirror. Harry stopped in the doorway. Clark stopped beside him. The mirror of Eris stood against the far wall, tall, ornate, the inscription along the top running backwards. Harry had read about this mirror. He looked at it carefully, and not at what it might show him, but at its function. The way Dumbledore had apparently repurposed it as the final protection, not as a lock but as a test. The stone was somehow inside the mirror's mechanism, available only to someone who wanted to find it but not use it. Clever, Harry said. Not admiringly, analytically. What does it show? Hermione said from behind them. She'd been here 2 seconds and was already cataloging. Your deepest desire, Harry said. For most people who want the stone, it shows them using it, immortal, transformed. The stone never actually appears. For someone who just wants to find it, he looked at the mirror. It would give it to them. He stepped forward and looked in. He saw Clark standing beside him and Ron and Hermione behind them, and there was something else. A woman he'd never seen a photograph of but recognized in the structure of her face, green eyes and red hair, standing slightly behind and to the left with her hand on his shoulder. She was smiling. She looked like someone saying, yes, exactly right, I knew you'd figure it out. He felt something push against the back of his eyes. He blinked it down, clinical. He also felt something solid and warm settle into his pocket. He looked down, then he looked at the mirror. His reflection was empty-handed. I have it, he said. Clark came to stand beside him and looked in the mirror. Harry didn't ask what Clark saw, and Clark didn't say. But after a moment, Clark said quietly, yes, I see. Harry glanced at him. Clark's expression was complicated in the specific way of someone seeing something they'd wanted for a long time suddenly made visible in a form they hadn't anticipated. We should go back up, Harry said. Harry, Hermione said from the doorway. Her voice had changed. There's someone behind us. Quirrell stood in the potion chamber doorway. He'd come through faster than Harry had calculated, which meant he'd found the harp that calmed Fluffy, which meant he'd been preparing longer than Harry had given him credit for, and Harry filed the miscalculation with the specific displeasure of someone who did not enjoy underestimating things. But the calculation he'd missed wasn't Quirrell's timeline. It was the company. Behind Quirrell in the doorway of the troll chamber, 3 figures stood. They wore dark robes and masks, and they weren't Death Eaters in any formal sense. They were mercenaries, bought not with ideology but with gold, which made them simultaneously less dangerous and more unpredictable. And one of them was holding something. Harry clocked it immediately. A cylinder roughly the size of a torch, glowing faintly green at one end, not the natural, organic green of ordinary magic, but a specific chemical green that his cells registered before his eyes fully processed the color. K-red. He felt it before it was close. A slight pressure, a hum at the frequency of something trying to push against a door that was welded shut. His magic surged in response, automatic and immediate, the integrated systems doing precisely what Diana had predicted, counterbalancing, compensating, the loop closing without his deliberate involvement. Nothing happened to him. He stood completely fine. The weapon doesn't work, he said to the room in general, to the man holding the cylinder specifically. If it's designed to neutralize me, tell whoever made it that the cellular integration is deeper than the model predicted. The mercenary looked at the cylinder, looked at Harry. Quirrell or Voldemort, who had clearly reached further forward in this moment of high stakes, looked at Harry with an expression that was revising itself in real time. Fascinating, the voice said, you're telling the truth. I don't lie about things like this, Harry said. It wastes everyone's time. Clark had moved. Not obviously, not the cinematic arrival of Superman, no cape, no proclamation. He'd simply repositioned, placing himself between the mercenaries and Hermione and Ron with the efficiency of someone who had done this in some form 10,000 times and didn't need to announce it. Quirrell, Harry said, the stone is already out of the mirror. You know you can't get it back from me and you can't use your weapon, and he looked at the figure behind Quirrell's eyes, held that gaze. You know you're not going to win this tonight, you're too intelligent to not know that. You're quite right, Voldemort said, and then Quirrell's hands came up and the air cracked. Not a spell, not any spell from the textbooks. Something older, something that Voldemort had been carrying for 50 years of dark practice, a compression of pure hostile intent shaped into force. It hit Harry in the chest and he took half a step back, half a step. He looked down at his chest, looked up. That's your best, he said. The mercenaries broke first. Two of them, the ones without the cylinder, turned and ran, which was the tactically sound choice, and Harry gave them credit for recognizing it. The third, with the cylinder, tried once more, holding it directly toward Harry at point-blank range with the desperate hope of someone who'd been told the weapon worked. Harry took it from his hand. He didn't move fast to do it. He just reached out and the man's grip opened, the way people's grips opened when they were suddenly, comprehensively aware that force was pointless. He held the cylinder and looked at it. K-red. Green at the core, something darker in the outer layer, the treatment Luther had described. He could feel it working, genuinely working. He could feel the interference pattern and being entirely countered, his cells routing around it like water finding the path of least resistance. He pocketed it. Evidence, he said, for later. Voldemort, through Quirrell, was doing something Harry recognized as calculation, the reconfiguration of a strategy that had just had two load-bearing assumptions removed. He looked at Harry and at Clark and at the three people arrayed around them and did what intelligent things did when the tactical situation was unwinnable. He pivoted. Harry Potter, Voldemort said, and the voice was quiet now, the performance stripped back, something more genuine in it. You are remarkable and you are wasted here. Thank you, Harry said. I'm not interested. You haven't heard power, purpose, a place worthy of my abilities, Harry said. Is that roughly the offer? A pause. You've heard it before, Voldemort said. I've been anticipating it since I read about you, Harry said. The answer is number, not because I'm afraid of power. Not because I'm constrained by rules or sentiment, but because you're wrong about what I want and wrong about what the world needs. He met those ancient, cold eyes. You want to be above people. I'm interested in being useful to them. These are fundamentally different orientations and no offer bridges that gap. The silence was genuine this time, not calculated, not strategic. Voldemort was, for perhaps the first time Harry had witnessed, actually listening. You're very young, Voldemort said. You're very old, Harry said. Hasn't helped you yet. Clark moved, a slight shift, a readiness, and Voldemort saw it and made his decision. The voice said, we will continue this conversation, Harry Potter, when you have more of the full picture. And then Quirrell's body crumpled, not dead. Harry checked immediately, pulse, breathing, both present. Voldemort had simply evacuated the host, leaving Quirrell collapsed on the stone floor with the specific boneless quality of someone whose animating force had abruptly vacated. He'd escaped through the walls, through the stone and magic of the castle, gone the way something without a body could go when it had the will and the experience to do it. The chamber was quiet. Hermione was already moving to Quirrell, checking him. Ron was standing with his wand out, the specific post-adrenaline stance of someone who'd held their nerve through the whole thing and was now feeling it catch up. Clark stood in the center of the room and looked at Harry with an expression that was several things layered on each other. You all right? Clark said. Yes, Harry said. The cylinder bothered my cells slightly, not enough to matter. He held up the stone in his other hand. We have what we came for. Harry, Ron's voice was controlled but slightly strained. That was Voldemort. Yes. You just told Voldemort he was old and wrong and number, yes. Ron looked at the ceiling with the expression of a man confirming his own ongoing sanity. Right, that's fine, that's normal, I'm fine. You were exceptional tonight, Harry said. The chess board specifically. Ron's expression came down from the ceiling and found Harry's. The post-adrenaline was still there, but something else had arrived with it, something solid. Yeah, he said. Wasn't I? Hermione sat back from Quirrell, who was breathing steadily. He'll need medical attention. Whatever Voldemort was doing to sustain the possession, his body's been through something. She looked up at Harry. What do we do with the stone? Harry looked at it. The Philosopher's Stone, small, dark red, fitting in his palm with no particular drama. He thought about what it meant, what it could do, what it had almost done. He thought about Voldemort's face when he said remarkable. Dumbledore, he said. We give it to Dumbledore, and we have a conversation with him about the difference between sufficient protections and actual protections. He's not going to love that conversation, Ron said. No, Harry agreed, but he's going to have it. Dumbledore was in his office when they arrived. He was behind his desk with the expression of a man who had just received intelligence about what was happening under his school and had come to his office to meet it rather than running toward it, which Harry read as either tremendous composure or a specific kind of trust. Possibly both. He looked at the four of them. At Quirrell, whom Clark was carrying with the gentle competence of someone accustomed to carrying casualties. At the stone in Harry's hand. At Clark. I see, he said. He came around the desk and took Quirrell from Clark with the help of a mobilizing charm, settling him on a conjured stretcher. He called for Madame Pomfrey without raising his voice, through some mechanism of the castle's awareness that Harry had noticed before. Then he sat behind his desk and looked at Harry. Harry put the stone on the desk. I'd like to have the conversation about the protections, Harry said, in the morning if that's acceptable with my father present. Dumbledore looked at Clark. Something moved between them, the acknowledgement of a shift in the architecture, the understanding that the board had changed. In the morning, Dumbledore agreed. He looked at the stone on his desk, then at Harry. You might have kept it. I know, Harry said. I didn't want to keep it. I wanted the situation resolved. He paused. You can destroy it. Nobody should have it indefinitely. Dumbledore was quiet. The elixir of life gives you more time, Harry said, but it doesn't give you more life. There's a difference. Flamel would understand that better than most. Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. Something in his expression was, for the first time in Harry's experience of him, not the carefully maintained composure of someone managing a great deal of information and a great deal of responsibility. It was simpler than that. It was the expression of someone encountering wisdom from a direction they hadn't expected and not being too proud to receive it. I'll speak with Nicholas, he said. Good night, Professor, Harry said. He led them out of the office, the four of them back into the corridor, the castle quiet and warm around them. Clark walked beside him and Ron fell into step on his other side, and Hermione was slightly behind, still writing in her notebook because she would process better with a pen in her hand, and they all knew this. Hogsmeade tomorrow, Ron said, which was so entirely normal that Harry actually stopped walking for a second just to appreciate it. What? First Hogsmeade visit of the term is tomorrow. 3rd years and up, obviously, so we can't go. But Fred and George have offered to bring back butter beer for the rest of us if we give them the money in advance. He paused. I'm just saying, normal Saturday. It can still be a normal Saturday. Harry looked at him. It can. Good, Ron said. Because I'd really like a normal Saturday. Clark looked at Ron with something in his expression that had been building over weeks of these exchanges and was now fully assembled. A warm, comprehensive appreciation for what Ron Weasley was in Harry's life, which Clark had understood intellectually but was now understanding completely. I'll join you for breakfast, Clark said. If the invitation, obviously, Harry said. Obviously you will. Except it wasn't a normal Saturday. The Hogsmeade visit was underway, 3rd years and above filing down the path to the village in clusters, the November day sharp and clear. When the disturbance started at the village perimeter, Harry felt it before the alarm bell. A displacement of air, a quality of wrongness, the particular sensory signature of something happening at scale in a space that couldn't contain it. He was at breakfast when it started, and he was out of his seat and moving toward the doors before the bell had finished its first toll. He heard Clark behind him, the rapid, deliberate footsteps that were Clark Kent about to stop pretending to be Clark Kent. The great doors opened and Harry came out onto the steps and saw it. Hogsmeade was on fire. Not from a natural source, this was magical fire, dark at the edges, burning wrong, and through the smoke the shapes of figures moving, some masked, some not, all of them moving with the organized precision of people who had planned this. Approximately 12 combatants, Harry estimated. The students who'd been heading to the village were stopped on the path, scattered, the prefects trying to herd them back. And at the center of it, landing with the precise controlled impact of a man who had stopped pretending. Clark Kent, no longer Clark Kent, the jacket gone and with it the posture and the glasses, standing in the Hogsmeade Road with the morning sun on him and the fire behind him. Harry ran, not at a human pace. He covered the distance between the castle steps and the edge of the village in a time that would not have made sense to anyone tracking it, arriving at the first cluster of combatants with a momentum that he controlled precisely and completely. A masked figure turned toward him with a drawn wand. Harry took the wand from their hand without breaking stride, left them standing empty-handed and confused, moved to the next. He wasn't using magic. He didn't need to. He moved through them with the specific, contained force of someone who understood exactly how much of what they were capable of was required, and used precisely that amount, enough to disarm, to neutralize, to take the operational capacity out of each threat without causing unnecessary damage. These were people. Hired, probably frightened under the masks, doing this for money or for fear. He wasn't angry at them. He was just efficient. Clark was handling the fire, the genuine structural fires, buildings catching in the wake of the combat, with the speed and precision that was simply what he was, moving through the village like a force of nature that was also somehow being very careful about where the force went. Harry tracked him in his peripheral vision, and they worked the space without discussing it, the way things that were tuned to the same frequency didn't need to negotiate. One of the combatants was different. He felt her before he saw her, a quality of magic that was cold and precise and deeply practiced, nothing like the raw fire the others were throwing. She was standing on the roof of the three broomsticks, and she had a wand in one hand and in the other the distinctive angular shape of a launcher, not magical, not from this world. She fired. The projectile moved fast, not as fast as Harry. He stepped sideways and let it pass, the cylinder tumbling end over end into the street behind him, where it detonated in a pulse of green-black light. He felt the pulse hit him. Felt the interference pattern, K-Red again, a more sophisticated version than the one he'd pocketed last week, and he felt his cells push back and the system's balance, and nothing. He was completely fine. He looked at the woman on the roof. She was looking back at him. Behind her mask, her eyes were doing the calculation. The weapon had hit directly, and the target was standing there holding eye contact with her. He crossed to the building wall and went straight up it, not climbing. Just moving vertically, the grip of his hands and feet against stone, finding purchase the way they always did, his cells not particularly concerned about gravity as a guideline. He was on the roof in 4 seconds, and the woman was backing up and drawing a second wand, and he walked toward her unhurried and said, "The weapon doesn't work. I know you're following orders. I know you're probably not here because you want to be." He stopped 4 feet from her. "Tell me who sent you." She threw a binding curse. He walked through it. It prickled slightly, the way a strong magic generally prickled when aimed at him, a genuine interaction, genuine interference, and then his own magic countered it and it dispersed, and he was still walking. She threw everything she had. 7 spells in quick succession, high-tier combat magic, the kind that would have flattened most witches and wizards. He walked through all of them with the same steady progress and the same expression of someone politely waiting for something to finish. She stopped. "Who sent you?" he said again. "Last time asking." "Malfoy," she said, her voice was strained. "Lucius Malfoy." Luther gave him the weapons and Malfoy supplied the team. "Thank you," Harry said. He summoned her wands, both of them neat, into his hand and handed them to McGonagall, who had somehow arrived on the roof of the three broomsticks with an expression that suggested she was going to need a long time to process this day. "She'll cooperate," Harry told McGonagall. "I think she's done." McGonagall looked at Harry, looked at the prisoner, looked at the wands. "Potter," she said. "Yes, Professor." "Come down from this roof." "Yes, Professor." He went down, not the way he'd come up. He stepped off the edge and let himself drop, landing in the street without particular drama, the slight compression of his knees more habit than necessity. Clark was beside him in the next second, the village clearing around them, the fires out, the combatants in various states of contained. The Aurors arrived 14 minutes later. They arrived to find the situation fully resolved, 12 incapacitated combatants, the fires extinguished, every student accounted for, and 2 people standing in the middle of the Hogsmeade Road who gave the arriving Aurors a moment of very specific professional confusion. The senior Auror, a capable-looking woman with cropped gray hair, looked at Clark, looked at Harry, looked at Clark again with the specific expression of someone recognizing a face. "You're," she started. "Clark Kent," Clark said. "Daily Planet." "You're also," she stopped herself. "I'm Harry Potter's father," Clark said. "I was visiting the school." The Auror looked at Harry, looked at the wands he was still holding. "Mr. Potter, are you quite all right?" "Yes," Harry said. He handed her the wands. "The woman who was on that roof has information about Lucius Malfoy's involvement in organizing this attack and about the weapons being used. She'll cooperate, I believe." "I'd start there." The Auror looked at him for a long time. She was, Harry thought, doing the recalibration that adults did when reality declined to match their model. Then she nodded once, the nod of someone choosing to update the model rather than fight the evidence. "Yes," she said, "I'll do that." Ron arrived from the direction of the castle at a sprint, Hermione 2 steps behind, both of them visibly calculating whether they were arriving in time for something or after it. They arrived in after it and read the situation in about 4 seconds. "We missed it," Ron said. "I'm sorry," Harry said. "You're not sorry," Ron said, not accusatorially, just accurately. "No," Harry admitted. "Not very. Did anyone get hurt?" Hermione asked, scanning the street. 3 students with minor injuries from the initial panic. Buildings are intact. Nobody from the attacking side is seriously hurt. Harry looked around the village, the smoke clearing, people beginning to emerge from shops and doorways, the particular quality of aftermath in the air. "We're fine." Hermione looked at him, at Clark, back at Harry. "You ran through combat spells," she said. "I saw from the path." "They didn't work particularly well," Harry said. "They also used the cylinder weapon." "Didn't work at all." She was quiet for a moment. "Luther's going to know it failed." "Yes," Harry said. "Which means he'll try something different." "Yes," Harry said. "He will." He looked at Clark. "That's the next chapter." Clark looked back at him. In the thin autumn sunlight, in the clearing smoke of a village that had been attacked and defended and was already beginning to return to itself, Clark Kent looked at his son with an expression that had stopped being complicated and become something simple. "We'll be ready," Clark said. Harry nodded. The Aurors moved through the street around them, and the last of the smoke drifted upward into the November sky, and somewhere behind them Hogwarts stood on its hill, alive and ancient and entirely itself, as it had been for 1,000 years and would be. Harry was already thinking about Luther, about the next version of the weapon, about the sequence of moves that led from here to the final board. He wasn't afraid. He was, in a deep and specific way, ready. Chapter 6, Legacy of Two Worlds. The meeting happened on a Tuesday. Not dramatically. Not with forewarning or ceremony or the sense of a clock counting down. Harry came out of Charms to find an owl waiting on the corridor windowsill with a folded note that had no seal and no signature, just a Metropolis postmark and 4 words in a handwriting he didn't recognize. "I'd like to talk." He showed it to Clark that evening. Clark read it and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Lex." He could have sent something threatening, Harry said. He didn't. He sent a request. "Lex Luthor requesting things is more dangerous than Lex Luthor demanding them," Clark said. "When he asks, he's already decided the answer is yes." "Maybe," Harry said. "Or maybe he's recalibrating. The Hogsmeade weapons failed. His intelligence about my biology was wrong. He's a man who respects accurate information and he's just received some." He set the note on the desk between them. "I want to meet him." Clark's expression did several things. "Harry, he's not going to hurt me." "I know he's not going to hurt you, that's not." Clark stopped himself, chose again. "Luthor is the most dangerous human being I've ever encountered, not physically, intellectually. He talks to people and after the conversation they find they've agreed to things they didn't intend to agree to. Then come with me," Harry said. "He didn't invite me." "I'm inviting you." Harry looked at him. "He knows who you are to me. He's not going to pretend you don't exist. Bring Luthor into the open and he loses the advantage of operating in shadow." Clark looked at him for a long time. "You've been thinking about this since Hogsmeade." "Since before Hogsmeade," Harry said honestly. "Luthor and Voldemort have the same fundamental problem. They're both working from incomplete intelligence about me. Voldemort got some of it corrected in the chamber. Luthor got the practical demonstration at Hogsmeade. Neither of them has the full picture." He paused. "I'd rather give Luthor the full picture in a controlled conversation than have him keep running experiments." "And Voldemort?" "Different conversation," Harry said. "Different approach. Voldemort doesn't want information. He wants power. Those require different responses." Clark sat back. He had the expression of a man who understood the logic and was working through the emotional objection to it, trying to decide which was more accurate to the situation. Harry waited because Clark's process was worth waiting for. He didn't make decisions quickly, but when he made them they were right, not in the absolute sense but in the sense of being fully committed to, which made them practically right even when they were theoretically imperfect. "I'll come," Clark said. Hermione and Ron found out the next morning, as they always found out about things, Hermione by deduction and Ron by Hermione telling him with the specific tone that meant brace yourself. Ron's response was, "You're going to meet Lex Luthor." "Yes," Harry said, "the Lex Luthor who tried to weaponize Kryptonite against you." "Yes, and your plan is to just go talk to him." "Essentially," Ron looked at the ceiling. "Right," he looked back down. "Can we come?" "No," Harry said. "Can we be somewhere nearby in case?" "You'll be here and you'll be fine," Harry said. It's not a battle. It's a negotiation and I need the other party not to feel outnumbered." He looked at Ron. "I need you here running point on the Voldemort situation. We've still got the stone issue, Dumbledore's having it destroyed but not until next week. If anything moves before then, I'm on it," Ron said. "Settled, direct, no further argument." This was something Harry had noticed about Ron over months. His emotional process was visible and fast, and he landed on the right side of it without long deliberation. He argued with Harry when he thought Harry was wrong and backed him completely when he decided Harry was right, and the transition between those two states was cleaner than almost anyone Harry had met. Hermione had her notebook already open. "What do you need from us?" "Keep watching Quirrell," Harry said. "He's been absent from classes for a week. Madame Pomfrey says he's recovering, but Voldemort doesn't need a recovered Quirrell to have a conversation with me. He'll use any channel available. If anything changes, we'll send a patroness," Hermione said and then looked up. "Which you still need to teach me properly because my practice attempts are after this," Harry said. "I promise." Luther chose neutral ground. The letter had specified a location in London, a private dining room above a quiet restaurant in Mayfair, the kind of establishment that existed for conversations requiring discretion. Harry arrived with Clark by train, which Clark had suggested on the grounds that arriving any other way would announce capabilities that were better held in reserve. And Harry had agreed, while privately noting that discretion worked differently depending on who you were trying to hide from, and Luther would know exactly how they'd arrived regardless. The room was clean and spare and expensive in the way that money expressed itself when it was completely confident, nothing showy, nothing performative, just quality so thorough it became invisible. A table with 3 chairs, food that had been prepared and sat waiting. No staff. Lex Luthor stood at the window. He was not what Harry had expected from the intelligence profile he'd assembled, and Harry had been thorough, spending 2 full library sessions with everything Clark had on file plus the public record. The photographs showed a tall, bald man with the kind of face that looked good in photographs and probably looked different in person. The in-person version was correct in its details but wrong in its aggregate. The photos hadn't conveyed the quality of attention that came off him in the way that temperature came off a fire, the specific alertness of someone who processed the world faster than the world typically knew to account for. He turned when they entered. His eyes found Harry first. This was, Harry noted, a choice. Clark was larger and more visually striking, and Luther turned to Harry first. "Harry Potter," Luther said. His voice was moderate, controlled, the voice of a man who had learned early that volume was amateur. "I've been looking forward to this." "I know," Harry said. "Please don't." Luther paused. Something moved in his expression, genuine surprise, quickly managed. He looked at Clark. Clark. The name was said with a warmth that wasn't warm, that used the frequency of warmth as a tool. "This is unusual. You came." "He invited me," Clark said. "He invited." Luther looked at Harry again and something shifted in his assessment. "You invited him." "Not the other way. He tried to talk me out of it," Harry said. "I disagreed." He sat down without waiting to be asked. "Sit down, Mr. Luther. The food looks good and I'd like to eat while we talk." A beat, then Luther sat, Clark sat. The specific strangeness of the 3 of them around a dinner table settled into something that was either acutely tense or Harry was choosing to frame it simply honest. "Your weapon failed," Harry said. He served himself, which was also a choice. The first person to take food in a negotiation establishes appetite, ease, absence of anxiety. Both versions, I assume you know that. "I know," Luther said. The feedback from the Hogsmeade device was unambiguous. The K-Red model was based on a flawed assumption about the integration pathway. He looked at Harry with the unself-conscious analytical interest of someone who found a problem more engaging than its implications. "The magic and the Kryptonian biology aren't parallel systems. They're one system," Harry said. "Your targeting model assumed 2 discrete inputs. You were attacking the junction point between them, which is, as a strategy, equivalent to trying to cut water by hitting the place where 2 currents meet." Luther was quiet for a moment. "That's an elegant analogy." "It's an accurate one," Harry ate. "You spent considerable resources on an approach that was never going to work and you now know that definitively. I'd like to discuss what you do with that information." "What makes you think I'm open to that discussion?" "Because you're here," Harry said. "You sent a request, not a demand. You chose a private room with no staff and no recording. You're not performing this meeting for an audience. That means it's genuine." He looked at Luther steadily. "You're curious. You want to understand what I am correctly because you're a man who finds operating from inaccurate data intolerable." Luther looked at him for a long moment. "You're 11 years old." "Everyone says that," Harry said. "It never changes what I just said." Something in Luther's expression did what expressions did when they encountered something genuinely unexpected. The micro-adjustment, the recalibration, quick and controlled but visible to anyone paying the right kind of attention. "All right," he said. "What is it you want to discuss?" "I want to discuss what you intend to do about me," Harry said. "And I want to discuss it honestly, which means I'll tell you accurately what I know about what you know, and you tell me accurately what you're planning, and we find out whether there's a version of this where you stop developing weapons against me. And if there isn't, then we're still ahead, Harry said. I'd rather know your actual intentions than the version you'd perform for someone you were managing. Clark was watching this exchange with the expression of someone watching a chess game and being slightly unable to reconcile the player with the age. Harry didn't look at him. He kept his eyes on Luther because Luther's eyes were where the information was. Luther leaned back slightly. What I want, he said, with the specific quality of a man deciding to be genuinely direct, is to understand you, not as a threat or a weapon. As a phenomenon, a Kryptonian magical hybrid has never existed. The implications alone are fascinating, Harry said. I know I've been thinking about them since September. He set his fork down. You want to study me, I understand the impulse. I'd want to study me too, but there's a significant difference between scientific interest and the approach you took, which was first to weaponize what you knew and then to consider the science. A practical man prepares for threats before I wasn't a threat to you, Harry said. I'd never heard your name before September. You became relevant to me because you became relevant to Voldemort, and Voldemort became a problem I needed to address regardless of you. He picked up his fork again. I'm not your enemy, Mr. Luther. I'm not interested in being your enemy. I'm interested in there being one fewer person developing weapons against me while I'm trying to get through my first year at school. Luther looked at him for a moment, then unexpectedly he smiled, not the controlled social instrument he'd used on Clark's name, a genuine one, briefer and more complicated. You're quite serious. I'm always quite serious. I believe you, he glanced at Clark. He's always this direct, more or less, Clark said. I find it clarifying. I find it, Luther paused, choosing words with the care of a man for whom words were primary tools. I find it disarming. Which is, I suspect, the point. He looked back at Harry. What are you offering exactly, in exchange for ceasing the weapons program? Information, Harry said. Accurate information about my biology, not all of it. I'm not handing you a research file, but enough to replace the flawed model you've been working from so that whatever conclusions you reach going forward are based in reality rather than inference. A pause. And in return, you stay out of whatever happens with Voldemort. This is not your problem to solve. And if Voldemort becomes a problem that extends beyond the magical world, then we'll have a different conversation, Harry said. When that happens with information you can trust. Luther was quiet. You're asking me to trust you, he said. I'm asking you to trade accurate information for accurate information, Harry said. Trust is separate. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to update your model. Another silence. This one had a different quality, not resistance, but genuine thought, the specific silence of a very good mind running something through its full process. The cellular integration depth, Luther said. The magic and the Kryptonian biology. Is it genuinely complete, no separate pathways at any level? Fully integrated at the cellular level, yes. You can confirm this with independent analysis if you want. I'll provide a blood sample observed with no chain of custody that gives you a synthesis pathway. Harry met his eyes. I'm not naive about what I'm offering exactly enough to make weapons development pointless and nothing that helps you build something new. Luther was quiet for a long moment. Then, all right, he said. All right, you'll stop the weapons program. All right, I'll stop the weapons program. He said it without ceremony, the same way he said everything. And I'll pull the Malfoy connection. Whatever arrangement Lucius had, it's done. A pause. Voldemort's operation is not something I want to be adjacent to. It was tactically convenient and tactically I was wrong. Thank you, Harry said. He picked up his fork again. Clark was looking at the table with the expression of someone who had been braced for a much longer and more difficult version of this conversation. Clark, Luther said, he's extraordinary. I know, Clark said. You also clearly had nothing to do with it. He's been extraordinary since before I knew about him, Clark said. I showed up about 3 months ago. And yet here you are at his table. Luther looked at Harry. How do you find him as a father? Harry looked up from his food. Sufficient, he said. Clark made a sound that was almost a laugh. That's the most restrained positive review I've ever heard, Luther said. I'm 11, Harry said. I don't have a large sample size for fathers, but he showed up, that's the relevant fact. They took the train back to Hogsmeade in the late afternoon, the winter dark coming down early over the countryside outside the window. Clark sat across from Harry and they were both quiet for a while with the specific quality of quiet that had become comfortable between them, not silence that needed filling, just absence of noise that sat easily. That went better than I expected, Clark said. I thought it probably would, Harry said. He's not irrational, he's just misaligned. His objectives aren't evil, they're just oriented badly. Most people would describe someone who tried to weaponize kryptonite against an 11-year-old as evil. Most people, Harry agreed. I find the category less useful than asking what someone actually wants and whether it can be redirected. He looked out the window. Voldemort wants power over people. That's not redirectable. Luther wants to understand things and have security. That is, mostly. You're going to do this your whole life, Clark said. Aren't you? Find the leverage point and push exactly there. It seems to work. It seems terrifying, Clark said. Lovingly, Harry looked at him. Lovingly, Clark was quiet for a moment. The countryside moved past the window, dark and cold, the occasional light of a house. I've been thinking about what you said in Dumbledore's office, that I'm what you thought you might come from. I meant it, Harry said. I know I've been, Clark paused. I don't know how to do this well, I want to be clear about that. I missed 11 years. I didn't know you existed, and now I do, and I want. He stopped. I want more than I know how to ask for. I don't want to ask for more than you want to give. I'm trying to find the line. Harry looked at him. Outside the train window, a small station passed, lit and empty, a handful of people on the platform who were gone in a second as the train moved through. You don't need to find a line, he said. There isn't one. He paused. I spent 11 years in a very small space. I have a lot of room in me now for things that used to have nowhere to go. He looked back at Clark. You're one of them. Clark breathed in, out, the kind of breath that was doing specific emotional work. Okay, he said. Quietly, okay, Harry agreed. They sat as the train moved north toward the castle. 3 days later it came to a head, not the way Harry had expected. He'd been tracking the Voldemort situation with the same careful precision he brought to everything, noting that Quirrell's return to teaching had been brief and strained, that the man was diminishing visibly, not from illness but from the specific deterioration of someone whose body was being used too hard for too long. He'd been watching the third-floor corridor, the timing of staff movements, the patterns that would indicate a final move. He'd expected it at night. It happened in the afternoon in the middle of potions. The castle screamed. That was the only word for it, a sound that wasn't sound that Harry felt in his magic and his cells simultaneously, a signal from the building's ancient awareness that something was wrong inside it. He was on his feet before the sound had finished propagating. Snape looked up from the front of the class. His eyes found Harry's with the specific sharpness of a man who was also feeling something and was not going to acknowledge feeling it. Potter, he started. Harry was already at the door. He went up through the castle at a pace that didn't bother with the performance of walking, taking the most direct line, stairs 3 at a time, a corner cut by going through the shortcut behind the tapestry of Barnabas the Barmy that he'd mapped in October, the third floor arriving in under 90 seconds. The door was open. The corridor smelled of dog and something else, something that had been burning recently. He went through. The trapdoor was open. He dropped through without hesitation. The devil's snare didn't react to him. He moved through it the same way he always had, steady and unhurried. And the plant's tendrils reached and found nothing to grip and withdrew. The key chamber was already past, the door standing open, some of the keys in disarray. The chessboard was in ruins, pieces scattered, which meant someone had gone through it fast and without finesse, with power rather than strategy. The troll was still unconscious from 3 weeks ago. The potion chamber, wrong bottles removed, evidence of someone who'd had the answer and used it. He went into the final chamber, not Quirrell. Quirrell was gone, the robes were on the floor empty, which told a story Harry didn't like. The mirror stood against the wall. And in front of it, a figure that was barely a figure, translucent, wrong, something that occupied the space between having a body and not having one. Voldemort, without Quirrell's body. The possession had apparently reached its terminal stage, the host destroyed or abandoned, and what remained was this, the fragmented consciousness in its own reduced form, present through sheer will and the accumulated force of decades of dark craft. He looked more real than Harry expected. More there. The face was recognizable from description, or it was becoming recognizable as he drew on the ambient magic of the chamber, the castle's deep reserves. Harry felt the draw of it, the way Voldemort pulled at the magical energy in the room like a gravity. Harry Potter, Voldemort said. The voice was cleaner without a human throat, older, stranger, something that resonated at a frequency below speech. I wondered how long before you came. I came as soon as I felt the castle, Harry said. The castle told you. Something moved in the pale face. It chose you, I felt that too. A pause. I chose this castle too once, a long time ago. Harry looked at him. Tom Riddle, the air changed. You've done your research, Voldemort said. You were brilliant, Harry said, simply factually. You understood magic at a fundamental level that most people couldn't approach. You could have done extraordinary things. He paused. You chose a different direction. I chose power. You chose to be afraid of death, Harry said. That's different. He watched the pale face. Everything you've done, the Horcruxes, the conquest, the killing, it all starts with being afraid of ending. That's a small place to build a life from. You're lecturing me, Voldemort said. A child is lecturing me. No, Harry said. I'm telling you what I see, which is something you've apparently never had, someone who looked at you clearly and told you what was actually there. He held the gaze of those flat, terrible eyes. There's no version of this where you win tonight, you know that. You came here for the stone and I have the stone and I'm immune to your primary weapons and you're operating without a body. He paused. What do you actually want from this? A silence. What do I want? Voldemort repeated. From this specific conversation, Harry said, not the agenda, not the goals. What do you want from standing here and talking to me? The silence was very long. I want to understand you, Voldemort said. And it was the first thing he'd said in either of their conversations that didn't sound like a performance. The first thing that sounded like Tom Riddle, the brilliant frightened boy underneath all the architecture of Voldemort. I have never in all my years encountered something I could not model. I cannot model you. You are outside the frame of everything I understand. Good, Harry said. That's not, Voldemort paused. Most people would find that alarming. Most people are afraid of things outside their framework, Harry said. I'm not. I am the thing outside the framework. He looked at Voldemort steadily. You should be afraid of me, not because I'm going to kill you. I'm not, but because I'm going to be here every time, every version of this, and I'm never going to be what you expect. Why not kill me? Voldemort said. You could, in this state, because killing you in this state solves nothing, Harry said. You've fragmented your soul, Horcruxes, I've been reading about them. What you've done to yourself can't be resolved by destroying this piece. He paused, but it can be resolved, eventually, not tonight. The pale face was very still. You've found the Horcruxes, Voldemort said. I've found some of the theory, Harry said. The rest will come. He looked at Voldemort with the quality of patience that was not kindness exactly but was related to it, the patience of someone who had a long view and wasn't in a hurry. Go, he said. Recover, think about what I said, come back with better options. You're giving me a reprieve. I'm giving myself time to do this properly, Harry said, which is the same thing. Voldemort looked at him for a long moment. The ancient intelligence in those eyes was doing the thing Harry had seen it do twice before. Revising, recalculating, running a new model of the board. And then unexpectedly something else, something that crossed those alien features like light through deep water, something that was almost recognition. Your mother, Voldemort said. She looked at me the same way before he stopped. She saw me too, Harry breathed in. I know, he said. She said my name, not Lord Voldemort. Tom, a pause. No one had said it in years. Tom, Harry said, deliberately. The figure in the chamber flickered, not with weakness, with something more complicated. Then Voldemort Tom Riddle was gone. The chamber's magic steadied. The draw of energy stopped. The mirror reflected the empty room and Harry standing in it, alone. He stood there for a moment. He thought about his mother, the brief image in the mirror, her hand on his shoulder, the smile. He thought about what it meant that she'd looked at Tom Riddle and seen him clearly and been killed for it, and what it meant that her son had apparently inherited both her gift of clear sight and the capacity to survive it. He breathed out. He went back up through the chambers. Clark was at the top of the trapdoor. He'd come through the castle with the same speed Harry had, arriving not long after, following the same signal from the castle's deep magic, and he was standing at the trapdoor entrance when Harry came up through it. He looked at Harry. Harry looked at him. He's gone, Harry said. Not destroyed, gone. Clark studied his face. You let him go. Yes, because the Horcruxes exist, Harry said. Destroying the fragment here leaves the others intact. Until they're all dealt with, destroying one piece of him is pointless and potentially dangerous. A consciousness distributed across objects reduced further might make the remaining pieces less stable and more volatile. He paused. And because he stopped. Because what? Clark said. Because he looked at me and I saw Tom Riddle for a second, Harry said. Not Voldemort, the person underneath. I made a judgment call that the person underneath has more value than the destruction of the person on top. He paused. Maybe that's wrong, I'll reassess. Clark looked at him for a long moment. It's not wrong, he said. He stopped. It's the hardest possible version of right. We'll see, Harry said. It depends on whether he thinks about what I said. They came up into the third-floor corridor together, the castle normalizing around them, and found Dumbledore there, and McGonagall. And behind them, with the expressions of people who had been told to wait, and had waited approximately as long as they could manage, Ron and Hermione. Hermione had her notebook. Ron had his wand out, which he pocketed with the slightly abashed quality of someone who'd been holding it ready and was now acknowledging that the moment had passed. Harry, Dumbledore said. His voice was careful and specific. Are you? He's gone, Harry said. The stone is intact. He looked at Dumbledore with the directness that he always brought to this particular dynamic. We need to have the Horcrux conversation. Now. The full one, all of it, including how many there are and where they might be and what the plan is. He paused. Not because I'm demanding anything, because the strategy requires it. Dumbledore looked at him. Then at Clark, who met his gaze with an expression that was clear and undemanding and entirely aligned with what Harry had just said. My office, Dumbledore said, all of you. They went, the six of them, up through the castle, the corridors warm and familiar and alive, the portraits watching with open interest as they passed. Harry walked beside Clark with Ron on his other side and Hermione half a step behind making notes, and he felt the castle around them, the deep familiar hum of it, the vast slow intelligence that had recognized him the night he arrived on the lake. He'd thought then that it had been waiting for him. Maybe it had. Maybe that was the kind of thing ancient magical buildings knew, the coming of something that would matter, the approach of a person with enough of the right things in them to be both asset and legend. He wasn't thinking about legacy. He was thinking about the next problem and the problem after that, the Horcruxes, Luther's long game, the question of whether Tom Riddle had a piece of himself that could still choose differently. Big problems, real problems, the kind worth having. Dumbledore's office held all six of them with the comfortable ease of a room that had accommodated difficult conversations for a very long time and knew how. Harry sat. Clark sat beside him. Ron and Hermione took the chairs near the bookshelf, Hermione with her notebook open and Ron with the specific settled quality of someone who intended to be useful and was waiting to find out how. Dumbledore took his chair behind the desk and looked at the assembled group with the expression Harry had come to know over a year of these moments, the expression of a man updating his model of the world. The Horcruxes, Harry said. How many? Dumbledore looked at him. You know about them. I've been reading everything in the restricted section on soul magic and fragmentation since October. I couldn't confirm Horcruxes specifically without the reference texts from the Founders period, which I haven't been able to access. He paused, but the theory was consistent with everything Voldemort's done, the survival, the fragmentation, the inability to die from curse rebound. He looked at Dumbledore steadily. How many? 7, Dumbledore said, including, he paused, including one that you carry. The room went very still. Ron's expression moved. Hermione's pen stopped. Harry processed this. He ran the implications, the timeline, the mechanism, a piece of Voldemort's soul attaching to Harry in the moment of the curse, using Harry's own survival as an anchor. His body, his biology, his magic, robust enough to survive the killing curse, which nobody else had done, which meant the piece of Voldemort's soul had survived in a more stable host than it had intended. He thought about the connection he'd felt when Voldemort's presence was near, the specific resonance that was distinct from his sensitivity to Clark or the castle. I know, Harry said. Dumbledore blinked. I've felt it since I understood what to feel for, Harry said. There's something in me that resonates with him, not as a control, not as a weakness, just as an echo, something that's his, not mine. He looked at Dumbledore. Can it be removed without killing me? I believe so, Dumbledore said. Normally a Horcrux can only be destroyed in ways lethal to the host. However, he paused. You are not a normal host. The piece of soul attached to you is, from what I can determine, not integrated with your consciousness in the way it would be in a human. Your biology rejected the attachment. It exists in you the way a splinter exists in skin, separate, contained, not absorbed. Because my cells don't work the way human cells work, Harry said. The soul fragment couldn't take root properly. That is my belief, Dumbledore said, which means extraction rather than destruction may be possible. When? Clark said. He said it quietly and with complete focus. Not immediately, Dumbledore said. The research required. How long? Clark said. A year, Dumbledore said, possibly less with the right assistance. Clark looked at Harry. Harry looked back at him. Fine, Harry said. We have the other 6 to find in the meantime. He looked at Dumbledore. Give me everything you have on the others, locations, descriptions, what you've already destroyed versus what remains. He paused. And going forward, I want all of it, everything, not managed pieces, everything. Dumbledore looked at him for a long time. Yes, he said, yes. I should have from the beginning, I should have. He took off his half-moon spectacles and polished them, which Harry had never seen him do, a human gesture the kind that belonged to Tom Riddle's teacher, not to Albus Dumbledore the headmaster. I made decisions about what you needed, I should have asked. You should have, Harry agreed, not harshly, just accurately. But you can start now. Dumbledore put his spectacles back on, reached for a drawer, began pulling out files. They worked until midnight. The 6 of them around Dumbledore's desk and on the floor and in the chairs, papers spreading, maps marked. Hermione's notes filling her notebook and then a second notebook that Dumbledore produced for her, Ron cross-referencing dates against locations with the spatial logic that was his specific genius. Clark reading through intelligence on Horcrux locations with the focus of someone who could hold an enormous amount of information simultaneously and was already planning. Harry sat at the center of it and read and thought and occasionally said something that reorganized the pile. And the feeling of it, this specific particular feeling, was something he kept having to consciously not stop and examine, because stopping to examine it would interrupt the work and the work mattered, but the feeling was, this is what it looks like. A room full of people who were in it completely. Not one of them performing commitment, actually committed, each of them contributing exactly what they had. Hermione's precision and relentless need for accuracy. Ron's spatial intuition and his willingness to say that doesn't fit, go back one step. Clark's range and his calm and the way he read a document, and immediately extrapolated its implications 3 moves forward. Dumbledore's decades of accumulated knowledge and finally, his willingness to share it completely. And Harry at the center, holding it together not by being loudest or most certain, but by understanding everyone else well enough to know where their contributions stopped and started and routing the information accordingly. This was what he'd been built for. Not just the power, not the strength or the speed or the magic or the immunity, all of that was incidental. This was the purpose, to stand at the junction of things and hold them together. 2 worlds, 2 inheritances, 2 impossible sets of capabilities made not for domination but for this. This room, these people, this problem. He thought about what Voldemort had said, "You are outside the frame of everything I understand." And what the Sorting Hat had said, "Like a star had a child and the child learned to cast spells." And what Clark had said in his father's voice, quiet on a winter platform, "You're exactly right." Yes, Harry thought, that's about right. By the time they'd established a clear picture of the known Horcruxes, Slytherin's locket, Hufflepuff's cup, Ravenclaw's diadem, Nagini, the diary already destroyed, the ring needing careful handling, and mapped the intelligence gaps and assigned the follow-up research, the castle was deep into its nighttime quiet and the fire in Dumbledore's hearth had burned low. Ron was asleep in his chair. Hermione had stopped writing mid-sentence but still had her pen in her hand. Dumbledore was sitting back in his chair with his eyes closed in the particular way of someone thinking rather than sleeping. Clark looked at Harry across the table. "How are you?" he said, low enough not to wake anyone. Harry considered the question. He thought about the chamber, about Voldemort's face in the moment of recognition, about the Horcrux sitting in his cells like a contained splinter, something not his being, carefully held at arm's length by a biology that had been built for exactly this. "Good," he said truthfully. "The Horcrux doesn't hurt," Harry said. "It's been there my whole life, it's just there." He paused. "We'll deal with it." "We," Clark said. "We," Harry confirmed. Clark nodded. Something in his posture settled slightly, not relaxation exactly. More like the adjustment of someone deciding to put weight on a foundation they've been testing and finding that it holds. "Your mother," Clark said very quietly. "What you said in the chamber, that you knew she saw him the same way." He paused. "She was the most remarkable person I've ever met. You should know that." Harry looked at him. "I've thought about what she would have made of this," Clark said. "Of you, of everything." A pause. She'd have been so proud, not of the power of the choices." He looked at Harry steadily. "Every choice you've made since September has been, it's been her, the way she thought about people. What was underneath them, what they could be." Harry breathed in. He thought about the mirror, her hand on his shoulder. "I know," he said. His voice was very level. "I can feel it sometimes, the way things connect." He looked at his hands in the low firelight. "I never met her. I got a flash in a mirror, but I know her through me, the way you know something that's inside you." Clark said nothing. "She made good choices," Harry said. "Not all of them. Keeping you from knowing was wrong, whatever she thought at the time, but fundamentally she saw people clearly and she acted on what she saw." He looked up. "I think that's the thing worth inheriting." Clark's eyes were very bright in the firelight. He said nothing, which was the right answer. The fire crackled. Hermione shifted slightly in her chair, pen still in hand. Ron made a sound that might have been a comment on chess. Harry looked around the room, this room, these people, this accumulation of finding and choosing and building something real from the material of an impossible year, and felt down in his bones where the magic and the Kryptonian biology and the splinter of an old enemy all coexisted in improbable harmony, something that was simply, yes, this was it, not finished, not resolved. The Horcruxes remained. Luther remained, recalibrated but not removed. Voldemort was loose and thinking, somewhere in the dark, and whether Tom Riddle could become a different kind of story was a question that only time and the right choices would answer. The world was enormous and complicated and full of things that wanted to be impossible. Harry was also impossible. He thought, good, let's see what that's worth. In the morning, Ron woke up with a crick in his neck and complained about it extensively. Hermione found that she'd finished a sentence in her sleep that she didn't remember starting. Dumbledore made tea. Clark produced a newspaper from somewhere and read it at the table with the domesticity of someone who had made a decision about where he intended to be and was settling into it. Harry went to the window. The grounds were covered in the first real snow of December, deep and white and clean, the lake dark against it, the forbidden forest edge sharp and still. The castle rose around him. He could feel it humming in the walls, in the floors, in the particular resonance of old magic and older stone. He felt Clark behind him, 10 feet away, and Hermione waking up properly now with the sound of pen on paper, and Ron's voice asking something about breakfast. He felt the vast, warm thing in his cells that was both magic and not magic, both human and not human, both the inheritance of a man from a dead star and the inheritance of a woman who had looked at the worst thing she'd ever encountered and spoken its real name. He put his hand against the window glass. He felt it, the cold of it, the solidity, the way the stone of the castle continued into the glass, continued into the air outside. All one thing, all connected. He pressed his hand slightly. The glass didn't break, it held, he smiled. Outside, the snow kept coming down, steady and white and entirely indifferent to anything a boy with impossible genetics could do. And the world was large and complicated and full of things worth fighting for. And Harry Potter stood at the window of Dumbledore's office in the first real winter of his life as himself. Fully, completely, without reservation himself, and thought, first year. Wait until they see the rest.